IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It is Friday. That means it is mailbag time for this week. The Friday football mailbag is back. The Friday Free-For-All is back because we had a recruiting hour on Monday, kind of previewing, recapping last week's visitors, and then previewing what is coming up for Notre Dame this week. So today we're having a mailbag, and I'm happy to be here with you guys. Very excited about just everything going on in Notre Dame football right now. Tons to talk about. We have about 30 questions in already. Go ahead and get those questions in. I'm going to talk about the things you guys want to talk about today. We'll try to stick to football and whether it's football, recruiting, college football, Notre Dame football, whatever. But I know sometimes you guys like to get some other things in there, and we'll dive into those things as well if you guys really want to talk about it and we have time for it. Super chats get pushed to the top as soon as I see them. I push those to the top. We always appreciate those, obviously. But tons to talk about today. Notre Dame has the blue gold game tomorrow, and I know there's already some blue gold game questions in there, one from Andrew Burke that I see. So I'm looking forward to getting to those. But it can be about whatever you want to talk about the Notre Dame football team, Notre Dame recruiting, college football, whatever the case may be. So get those questions in now. And I'm just ready to dive right in. So like I said, we already have 30 questions already in there. And I'm ready to get rocking and rolling. I think, are you guys all ready to rock and roll? You all ready to go? I jumped in about 105, ready to go. So I'm good to go. I think you guys are all, based on the questions and the discussion happening in the chat, I think you guys are ready to go as well. So I'm doing very well. Hey, for all those people traveling to the Blue Gold game tomorrow, make sure you travel safe. Look forward to seeing if I see any of you there, it'd be great to see y'all there. But I definitely want to make sure y'all are able to get home safe and sound so we can do this thing again Saturday after the game, our post-game show. And, of course, we're going to have another mailbag on Monday. So I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the mailbag on Monday after we've had a chance to watch the spring game. So I'm ready to get rocking and rolling. If you guys are all ready to get rocking and rolling, and I think you guys are, so let's get going. I'm going to kick things off with a super chat from Rob Osgood. Thank you, Rob, so much. In your opinion, what has been the biggest positive and negative surprise of the spring camp? Rob starting me off with a tough one. The biggest surprise, positive surprise for me. Let me think about that one. Offensively, O-line, no real big surprises for me positively. Running back, no big surprises. Quarterback, wide receiver. I'm not really surprised that Jaden Greathouse is breaking out defensively. Trying to think about this. Well, I'll tell you, there aren't any really good surprises, meaning, I didn't know this guy was a good football player. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know that there's been any of those, but I'll give you a couple that are maybe surprises about the timing, or maybe they're things we were hoping would happen but didn't know for sure were going to happen. So I'll kind of answer it that way as best I can, Rob. And defensively, there's a couple. Number one is Adon Schuler's had a really, really good spring. And not that it was a surprise, like he couldn't have a good spring, but we really didn't know what he was going to bring to the table. We knew his talent. We knew what he did in high school. But, was he that guy? Was he somebody different? Was he – there's just a lot of things that factor into, to whether or not he was going to be a guy that you could really – say, okay, he's going to go out there and just really rock and roll and really be that guy and really be an impact player and all those type of things. And so, I think the fact that he has broken out the way that he has is, again, wouldn't say a surprise, but it was important, right? I mean, it was important that it happened, and they certainly are going to welcome that. And here's another one. I'm surprised. Now, this is, again, based off limited viewing. So this is based off of what we saw in the practices, the 5-period practices, and we saw, that's what most of the viewing was. We saw the first practice, which was non-padded, so you really can't tell a lot about non-skill players there, and then we saw the scrimmage. But I'll say this, from what I have seen, I'm really surprised at how physical and instinctive Kahanukia has been. And it's not that he wasn't a physical kid in high school. It's not that he wasn't an instinctive kid in high school. It's that he literally played zero football for 2 years. I mean, the kid was on a mission. It's not like he was playing on some semi-pro team or he was an injured player or a redshirt player that's still practicing and going in the strength program. I've been very surprised at how quick his adjustment back to football has been. Now, there's a lot that he still needs to do and learn and all that, but perfect example is the missed big play he had in the game on the scrimmage on Saturday. Reads it, flies downhill, tries to deliver a big hit, and kind of whiffs. That's the part where it's like, okay, that's what a kid who hasn't played football, it's going to happen to him when he's going against the running back at Notre Dame, who are all really good football players. But the instincts impressed me. The downhill toughness impressed me. The physicality at the point of attack impressed me. Like, all those things really impressed me to where you're like, hey, I know the missed tackle part is going to get, kind of figured out, right? That part's going to get figured out at some point in time. It's can he get the feel for physicality back? Can he get the instincts back? Can he make quick reads again? That stuff's all been there. And I'd say that's probably been the thing that surprised me that we've seen, like, that I wasn't expecting that. I didn't know if he would ever get back to that. We've seen kids go on missions and come back and they're just not the same player. Chris Badger was not the same player when he came back from his mission. We've seen it happen to quarterbacks at time. It doesn't happen to all the kids. Obviously, BYU and Utah's rosters are littered with kids who went on missions and came back and obviously were really good football players, but it hasn't been something that we've seen as much at Notre Dame and some other places. So that's probably been my biggest surprise so far this spring. I offensively, I'd say my biggest surprise has probably been, well, other than the fact that Rocco Spindler came back so much faster than expected. That was a pretty big surprise, and I'm very happy about that one. Jaden Harrison is a little bit better at receiver than I thought he would be prior to his injury. He looked a little better than I thought he would be. Those are positive ones. Negative ones, see, let me think about the negative ones. That's a good question. I don't really view things in spring in the standpoint of like they have to be a finished product. I'll just say this: it's not that it's a negative, it's a surprise, but it's a negative observation, and it's based again off very limited viewing time. So please keep that in mind. This isn't me saying that this guy's not going to be a good player and he's not what we thought he was going to be or anything like that. It's just a bit of a surprise. I thought that RJ Oben would look better than he did this spring. I just had expectations of a guy that's 6-year senior, played a lot of football, played a lot more at Duke than Javonte Jean-Baptiste played it at Ohio State, for example. I just thought he'd look better than what we've seen of him before. Now, the asterisk by that comment is, again, we haven't seen a lot of the spring practices. He may be dominant in all the other times we're not there. So, again, this is not meant to be predictive or to say, boy, he's just not going to be the player Notre Dame thought he would be. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just saying from what limited time we've seen, he just hasn't impressed me the way that I thought he would or hoped that he would. Doesn't look as big as I thought he would be. Just hasn't shown me the pass rushing repertoire so far that I thought. But again, I want to make sure that this is very clear. This is based on very limited data, and it's only off what I see. I haven't heard anything about him positively or negatively from any of the sources that I know. And so those are all aspects of it that I look into and say, okay, I think, yeah, I think he'll be okay. I think he'll be able to make some plays. I think he'll, based on what we've seen on film, it's just what I've seen in practice has not been as good as I'd hoped it could be. That's the really only surprise. Like the negative on offense is Jaden Thomas is hurt again. Like, that's a negative. Now, is it a surprise? No, not really. The surprise would have probably been, and I don't mean any disrespect by this, but the surprise would have been if he'd have made it through the whole spring healthy. That, that's really the big thing. So yeah, Steve, that's why I have to throw so many caveats to protect myself, because some people will take those comments and just run to a board and say, oh, Driscoll said this a bad thing about RJ Oben. So I have to make sure that I give myself that out to make sure people understand the context of what I'm referring to, because anyone that's telling you so-and-so's had a great spring and they're only basing it off of what they've seen, it's a misguided evaluation. I can tell you how well a player has played from in the practice I've seen. So when I tell you guys have had great springs or breakouts, it's not just what I've seen. It's partly what I've seen, but then also what I've heard from sources that I trust and different things like that is that's where the breakout aspect of it comes from for me. So that's a good way to kick things off, Rob. That's a good question. Obviously, I'm surprised. The one surprise I'll say this one. This is a good one. Just popped in my head. Bryce McPherson transferring. He has not looked good in practices that we've seen. He did not take that jump from the fall. He had a really good. He's an interesting player because if you look at him, he would have ranked top 20 nationally last year in yards per punt. He was about 45.1 last year in yards per punt. But if you look at the Notre Dame ranked, I believe I'd have to look it up, but I believe it's about 96th in punt yards allowed, punt yards per return allowed last year, which is not good. They were not a great punt cover team last year. Part of it was because of him, because it's not that it gets 45.1 yards on average. Are you getting any height? Are you kicking it to the right place? If you're supposed to kick it to the left and you kick it down the middle, that's going to hurt your team. That's not a good punt. I don't care if you punted it 55 yards. If the coverage is going left and you kick it to the right hash, then guess what? That's not a good punt. And when you look at his numbers, actually, let me pull this up because I was actually a little surprised by this, to be completely honest with you. I knew he wasn't great in this area, but when I looked at these numbers, I was shocked by it. So again, last year, 45.1 yards per punt. Didn't qualify for the national rankings because his 38 punts, he didn't have enough punts to actually do it. But here's an interesting stat. He only had 10 fair catches on his punts last year, and only 5 of his punts finished inside the 20-yard line. If you look at the year before with John Sott, he had 28 fair catches and 21 punts landed inside the 20-yard line. The year before that with Jay Bramlett, 24 fair catches, 19 landed inside the 20, which meant he was kicking a lot of balls out of the end zone, which means there was a lack of, like, if a guy's fair catching it, so if I'm averaging 40 yards a punt and 70% of my punts are fair caught and my net punting average is 38, and you're kicking 45 yards a punt, but the opponent's averaging 10 yards a return, and your net average is 35, I'm a better punter than you, because the net average is the one that you look at. And so a lot of people will look at it and say, hey, look, 45.1 yards per punt, that's pretty good, right? Well, it depends. Is the 45.1 getting up in the air and hanging up there to where teams can't return it or not? That's a different conversation. And as someone who's just booming it all the time. And so, those are things that you look at and say, hey, look, this is where you've got to be. And and Notre Dame just wasn't as good in that area last year. So that's going to have to be something that in my opinion gets a lot better. It's going to be the net punting average for the season. And I'm actually going to go look and see what Notre Dame's ranking was last year. Yeah. So for example, last year, as I said, Bryce McPherson average was ranked 19th in the country in yards per kick if he had enough qualifications. But Notre Dame ranked 83rd last year in net punting. Now, you could say, well, that's a coverage problem. Yeah, but when you have a guy that kicks the ball 38 times and only, 10 of his punts are fair caught, that means a lot of his punts are getting returned. A lot of his punts are getting returned. Where when you look at the year before and you look at John Sott's punting, John Sott wasn't getting nearly as many of his punts returned. And then they were, and that's just the fair catch data. How many times did we watch John Sott kick a ball that rolled and landed inside the 15 or the 20-yard line? So you're seeing a guy who maybe didn't have quite the average, although his 43.9 wasn't bad. But part of the reason his 43.9 was good, and Jay Bramlett's 43.8 were both better than what Bryce McPherson did, is because it's not just about the distance. It's about hang time and consistency and placement, things like that. And Bryce struggled with that. And so him not getting better and then transferring out were surprises to me, and disappointing surprises to me. So that would be the one thing I could confidently say was a negative for me to see. this offseason or this spring. Got another super chat from Iden Benami. How does Coach Marcus Freeman seem as an overall coach now? More confident, more aggressive. What's your mood tracker of the program right now? Well, I'll say I'll go backwards a little bit and start with the mood tracker. I'm excited about where this program is going. There are some question marks. There's some areas where I'm still a little bit like I don't know what the future holds. Like I was talking about how good the D tackle rotation was yesterday, and one of the people that in the response were, "I'm glad to hear you say that because Ryan and Bryan were real negative about the defensive tackle position from a recruiting standpoint." Those two things are completely opposite. Because I'm looking at it from what's on the roster now, and the majority of the rotation now, actually all of the rotation at defensive tackle, for example, is recruited by somebody that's not currently on the staff, somebody that's gone. Al Washington didn't recruit any of the guys that were in the rotation last year. I don't believe the only defensive line recruit that you could argue he recruited at all that's going to play this year is probably Boubacar Traore and Bryce Young. That's it. You get into RJ Oben, that's a transfer. That's a little bit of a different deal. So that's different than saying, oh, the future is bright because they've landed, this player, this player, this player. And so there's still some positions like that where I'm like, they got to consistently get better here, but it's looking at it from they're not recruiting like Georgia is. They're not recruiting like Bama has in positions like that. But overall, I love the direction of the program. I think this team, one of the things that I believe Marcus Freeman and Chad Bowden have done, and the rest of the staff have done a great job of is improving the skill talent at Notre Dame. Now, the 2025 receiver class right now is a bit of not as good as what it's been. But overall, that's not the track record we've seen. I mean, we've seen them add guys with this new staff, add guys like Jaden Greathouse and Braylon James, who has since transferred out, landing Jordan Faison as a walk-on, getting a guy like Rico Flores, who's a good player who's since transferred out, but then getting, KK Smith, finding a KK Smith, who I loved as a prospect. He's had a great spring. Keep an eye on him tomorrow in the blue gold game, getting a Cam Williams, getting a Micah Gilbert. They're able to add that kind of talent. The running back recruiting, the quarterback recruiting has been a huge upgrade, and that factors into a lot of my optimism. And Joe Rudolph is a guy that still has a lot to prove to me as a coach in regard to, is he an elite championship caliber coach? He's a good coach, but is good enough to win a championship at Notre Dame when you're O-line? That remains to be seen. But again, that was year one. Let's see what he does in year two. We saw Al Washington make a big improvement from year one to year two in regard to the production he got from his defensive line and the level of play compared to the previous year. And hopefully Coach Rudolph can make a similar jump. But the one thing Coach Rudolph has done since he got here is recruit well. We could debate, Anthony Knapp. I'm not as high on Anthony Knapp as others. Ryan is higher on Anthony Knapp than I am. There are some people that think he's a really good player. I think On3 had him ranked in the top 200. Others don't. So you could have some debate there. But the fact is there was some conviction there with Joe Rudolph. He saw Anthony Knapp in person on multiple times. He believed in the kid's film, and he went and got him. I like conviction. Even if I don't necessarily agree with your ultimate evaluation, as long as there's some conviction to it, I'm a fan of that. And I don't think there was any laziness to it. Other times you can be convicted in something, but over time you've kind of shown yourself to be a bit of a lazy evaluator. I don't think that's true for Joe Rudolph. There's no way that Joe Rudolph could have had competent offensive lines at Wisconsin if he was a lazy evaluator. No way. Because they almost entirely built their offensive line on evaluating lower-ranked kids. And they got some guys here and there. Logan Brown was a highly ranked kid. And they got a couple other guys, but most of their kids were three-star kids they had to go evaluate. And then he obviously kept Peter Jones in the class. He was able to go out and get Styles Prescott. Yes, Coach Easton did a good job of laying the foundation for Styles Prescott and Gerby Lambert, but Coach Rudolph had to put in a lot of work to finish the deal with those players, especially Gerby. And then he goes out in the 25 class, and he lands a really talented top 100 caliber player, Noah Strebig, a guy in Will Black that has a lot of upside that On3 thinks is a 5-star recruit. I don't agree with that assessment, but I love the potential there. And then, of course, Matty Augustine. And so, again, he's another one. That's a project type of player, but I love the conviction that Joe Rudolph had with that. And I see what he likes. Now, we'll find out if he can pan out, but there's a lot to like about what he's doing there. And so you're not taking a step back. And this is what would happen in the past. They'd have a great receiver class one year, but then the offensive line was not good, or the quarterback wasn't very good, or the running back room was not good. There was always these highs and lows in classes. This staff has been much more steady. The cornerback talent on defense since Marcus Freeman has taken over has really taken off. And Mike Mickens did a good job early as a recruiter, but it was a lot of a solo show. And so it wasn't until Marcus Freeman and Chad Bowden came in 22 that you started seeing recruiting really take off. Consider this, and I'm quite confident that I'm correct on this. Benjamin Morrison and Jaden Mickey did not have offers from Notre Dame when Marcus Freeman was hired. That was the upcoming class that they're working on. They weren't hired until after the December-January period. So that means they were offered like within the last couple months of what the 2025 cycle is. They were considered later offers. And, I don't think that has a lot to do with Mike Mickens' evaluation, but more so how offers and stuff like that were kind of thrown around. And so you saw that evaluation take place. You saw, and I'm talking about when Marcus Freeman was hired as the D coordinator, not as the head coach. I'm talking about as the D coordinator. So he was hired in December, January. Then you started to see those offers go out. You're seeing the linebacker recruiting has been consistently really good. You're seeing safety position was poor. It's starting to kind of rise up a little bit. So just overall length, athleticism, speed, skill, talent is all better than it was. And honestly, that was the area where Notre Dame was often lacking when they'd get into these big moments. It's like, they could compete against Clemson with their secondary and outside receivers, but they couldn't compete against Clemson with anyone beyond their starting cornerbacks, and they couldn't compete with Clemson at quarterback. You're seeing a little different deal now. They weren't, in 2019, they were good at certain positions against Georgia, but then they could compete on the edges. They could compete at safety in one corner spot, but they struggled at another. The linebackers weren't as good as they were the year before. So there's always been like those missing spots at non-line positions. I think the overall talent of those positions has just been so much better. So those are all things that are related to, in my opinion, Marcus Freeman being hired as the head football coach and the changes he's made, the people he's brought with him. You say, well, a lot of that credit goes to Chad. Okay, well, yeah, I think Chad Bowden deserves a lot of credit, but what was one of the non-negotiables for Marcus Freeman when he was hired as a defensive coordinator? I'm not coming if I can't bring Chad Bowden with me, right? I mean, because he understands the value that Chad brings to the program. And, he's the one that went out and hired, Deland McCullough and some of these coaches who've done the job that they've done from a recruiting standpoint. And so even some of the hires that you look at and you're like, I'm not sure. I didn't love the Al Golden hire. I'm going to be honest with you. He hadn't really coached in college in, 7-8 years. And I wasn't sure how he would adapt to being a coordinator. His first year was okay. It wasn't great. He didn't really recruit hard. But that's turned out to be a really strong hire. And they've figured out a way to make it work. And he's found a niche as a recruiter that's not get on the trail and grind and do this, but hey, be that closer, be that guy that sells your vision, and then let Chad and let the recruiting staff, let the position coaches and those guys really do the grinding. And it's worked really, to me, really well so far. So those are all things that have to do with Coach Freeman bringing that level of success. Now, the final piece is, and we don't know the answer to this yet, to be honest with you. And this is where we're going to have to find out, and why the first part of your question, I don't know that I have an answer to that I can say definitively is what it is. How is Marcus Freeman as an overall coach? I just mentioned a lot of things he does well. He's made some good staff hires. I haven't agreed with every staff hire, but I'm never going to agree with anyone all the time. Some of the disagreements I've had, I think I was right about. Some of the disagreements I had so far look like strong hires. Like I said, I didn't love them. I would have rather had Joe Rossi as the defensive coordinator when they were going through the first bouts of hires. When he hired Al Golden, I wanted Joe Rossi instead. And I think Joe Rossi's a heck of a defensive coordinator. But Al Golden the last 2 years had some pretty darn good defenses and has shown that he fits here at Notre Dame. And so that was one, if I were to look back and say, what was your stance on that hire? I didn't love that hire. And Coach Freeman's turned out to be right about that hire. It's worked out really well. So there's some of that to it. And that's where you got to praise him for it. But, can he put together the full season plan that allows Notre Dame to maximize its talent as a program and potential as a program? I don't know the answer to that. Can he get his team to answer the bell week after week after week. He hasn't shown that yet in 2 years. We saw the Stanford game the year before. We saw the Marshall game the year before. We saw second half against Navy where he just couldn't get his team out of that rut. We saw last year against Louisville, this team does not show up and really want to play. We saw a team against Clemson that just wasn't prepared to go out and win that football game. So we've seen still some of that. We don't know if Coach Freeman can get them over that hump. But what I have seen, however, is a coach that is very convicted in what he's doing, and that's important. And that can be an issue with younger coaches is they can err on one of two sides. And this is where I think Marcus Freeman has found a sweet spot, in my opinion, and why I'm probably more confident than I should in that he's going to win a championship at Notre Dame based on what he has shown or not shown. Like I said, nothing we've seen in the last 2 years should say, oh, yeah, that guy's going to win a championship, because there's been in-game mistakes. There's been, team not being ready in certain moments. But here's where I'm at with Marcus Freeman. You have to, as a young coach, as any coach of any age, but I think this is especially true of young coaches, because young coaches tend to they err on one of two sides. One is they're way overconfident and very arrogant to the point of they don't want to listen to anybody. I'm the smartest guy in the room. Yeah, if you don't do what I want to do, if you're not on the board with me, then I don't want to hear it. I'm the smartest guy in the room. And then there's young coaches that lack the confidence to really have those core convictions, and they can just kind of blow in the wind. If things don't go well, they'll abandon it and run over here, and they're unprepared to really lead a program. And leading a program means you're not just that guy when everything's going well, but you are still that leader when things aren't going well. And so when I look at Marcus Freeman, I'll in one breath tell you I'm concerned about knowing whether or not Marcus Freeman can develop a program and develop a team that can answer the bell every single week, week after week after week after week. But in the same breath, I'll also tell you, but what I have seen is when times have gotten tough, that's often when Marcus Freeman has shown himself to be at his best. And we've seen how they've bounced back from some of these tough losses. We saw a team really bounce back emotionally over a couple week period after a just devastating loss to Marshall, which followed a devastating loss to Ohio State because of how much they put into the offseason into that game. And then they bounce back well. Then you have just the travesty of the Stanford game. And then what does Notre Dame do over the next two games? I mean, they go out and handle business, right? They go out there and do what they need to do and go. I think it was the next week after Stanford, they beat UNLV. Then they go on the road and just smack a ranked Syracuse team. Then they smack Clemson in the mouth. And, they had that rough second half against Navy. And then the next week go beat BC 44-0. So outside of a half against BC, they came out of that Stanford game playing really good football. And then last year we saw it, same thing. You have the real tough 3-game stretch against Ohio State, Duke, and Louisville, where you were a lot closer to being 0-3 than you were to being 3-0 in that stretch. And what do they do coming out of that? They come out and they just roll USC, roll Pitt, and then you have a Clemson loss that was one of the worst losses of Freeman's tenure, in my opinion, in a lot of different ways. But what do? They come out of that and they just steamroll their next few opponents. I mean, just absolutely obliterate their next 3 opponents. They beat Wake Forest by 38. They beat Stanford by 35 and beat Oregon State by 32. So he's been able to say, hey, so we got to be able to say, look, you've got to be able to find a way to not have these moments over here. Stanford 2022, Marshall 2022, Louisville 2023, Duke 2023, Clemson 2023. Your team just wasn't ready in some way, some big way to really play close to, their A game. But we've seen that you can rally out of it. That other part's really important because nobody's just going to answer the bell and play A game every week. But what you found is you're going to be able to play at your highest level from an emotional standpoint, from a focus standpoint, and you're not going to have those days where you just don't look like you want to be there. There's going to be games you don't execute well. I don't care who you are. You're going to have games where you're just not on the same page. Your pass game can't get rolling. Your run game can't get rolling. You're just not on your P's and Q's the way that you normally are. But if you're there emotionally and mentally and you've got the talent, you can still do enough to win, right? And that's where Notre Dame has to get to, where they didn't lose to Stanford because the pass game couldn't get rolling and the run game couldn't get rolling or whatever. They lost to Stanford because that team they just didn't want to be there. They just mentally and emotionally were not there. And you can't just turn that switch on in the second quarter because you've fallen behind. That's just who you are at that point in time. So they got to get through that. But what we've seen from Coach Freeman is that he can get them out of those dark times, and that's very, very, very important. And now it's just about for Marcus Freeman, the question is not temperament for me. There's a couple things I'd like to see him. He's going to have, based on some things I've heard, he's going to have to make sure he's doing a little bit better job of knowing everything that's going on within his program, not just around the team, but also some of the stuff going on outside the program. There's been a few too many times that I've heard that Coach Freeman found out about something, wasn't happy about it, and then dealt with it. But it's like he should have probably known that sooner, right? And that's part of it. And that's that hard balance that every Notre Dame coach has gone through in my lifetime, which is you've got so many things pulling you in different directions. When I'm coaching D3 football, I'm not going, I mean, I may drive 20 minutes to go speak at some coaches clinic, and there's things like that happen, but I'm not spending all my time going over here to shake this person's hand and kissing this baby and going and speak in front of this $1 million donor and this $1 million, booster and all these other kind of things. I'm coaching football, and it's easier for me to kind of be in that day to day and know what's going on with my players, where when you're the head coach at Notre Dame, it's a lot harder to do that. And so he has to make sure that, hey, that's a blind spot for me right now, which means I need to make sure there's other things built into the program. There's other people that are involved in those things. The coaches have to have some accountability there. Support staff have to have some accountability there to make sure some things aren't falling through the crack. That's a challenge that's true for all Notre Dame head coaches. And I think he's still learning to get better there. So that's an area for it. But really what it comes down to is I love the confidence that he has in himself. I don't care about him being more aggressive per se. I think that's going to come down to when he's confident in his football team and he's confident in their ability to execute, he's going to be more willing to be aggressive. We've seen that at times. When he's reading the room and he feels like, okay, this offense is clicking, you'll see him be more willing to be aggressive on fourth down. You'll see him be more willing to hey, you know what? We might be at the end of our field goal range, but let's go for it, because there's faith in his defense and he feels like his offense is really clicking. But there's times when you're like, dude, I think you should have gone for it there. But a lot of times it's like, but I'm not reading it right now. I don't think we have it right now. And that's something that coaches have to be able to do. And they have to be able to identify that and make the right decisions because of it, but then also find ways to fix that. Hey, how do we get this thing rolling? And so I think those are things. So he's still developing. He's still learning in certain areas. But I think that the trend for Marcus Freeman has been up. We could debate the how high is the slope, right? I think that's up for conversation. I think it's pretty steady. I'm confident with it. But is it okay? Year 3, kick down the door, win a championship? We'll see. I don't know if it's there yet, but I do think it's been a steady jump, and I think this offseason has been the reason I would say it's a little sharper of an incline is just because of what we've seen this offseason, the aggressiveness he's had going after the right coordinators, and not only that, but what really impressed me about this OC thing is if Mike Denbrock ultimately doesn't make the move, the next candidate in line from who I believe that would have been a very strong hire as well. Not as proven, not as established, would have had some more questions, but I love what I've seen from that guy so far. That's Kirby Moore at Missouri. I believe Kirby Moore would have been the hire if it wasn't Mike Denbrock. The fact that you can get a guy like Mike Denbrock, and that's clearly the guy he wanted, but you're also not just going to run the risk of, well, what if he says no? Now I'm screwed. I thought he had a really good plan of attack this year when it comes to going after the coordinator. Why does that matter? Well, because it shows me that he learned from the year before, where you had basically 3 offensive coordinators essentially got offered a job in some capacity, and before you finally got your guy. There was a much better strategy involved. I'm not committing to this until I know if my number one guy is going to say yay or nay. And they ultimately got their number one guy in Mike Denbrock. So I think there's been a lot of things we've learned from him, or we've learned about him about how he has learned from failures and mistakes. And that's huge, because if you're too arrogant to realize you're the problem, then you're always going to deflect. That was Brian Kelly's biggest issue. It was always somebody else's fault. And when you're always blaming other people for why you're making mistakes, not only does that make me question your moral character, it also makes me question your ability to make the decisions needed to really maximize your program or yourself as a human being. And so those are things that we have certainly seen from Marcus Freeman when it comes to being a football coach, is his ability to go out there and say, hey, this is what I believe in. This is what we're going to do. But we also have to be smart enough to say, hey, we've got to get better here. I thought this was going to work. It didn't work. We've got to go out and get better. And we've certainly seen that from Coach Freeman so far. Zay asks, we have a super chat here, or a question here from Zay. I appreciate that. This was actually the first one of the day, so I certainly appreciate that. And Zay says, why do you think it took so long for Joe Alt to become the clear number one offensive tackle prospect, even though it was obvious for so long? I'm assuming you're talking about the NFL draft, Zay. So I'm going to dive into it in that regard. I don't know that it took so long. I think it actually went back and forth. I think when this draft cycle first started kind of coming into clear vision, I think a lot of people that I read anyway did have Joe Alt as the number one. I think the reason that you're seeing others is because, number one, there are other very talented offensive tackles in this draft class. Yes, I believe Joe Alt's the clear number one, but it's also not a year where it's like Joe Alt and a bunch of guys you're not really sure about. It's Joe Alt and a bunch of guys that are really, really talented players in some capacity. I would absolutely take Joe Alt over Olu Fashanu. I would absolutely take Joe Alt over Troy Fatamu at Washington. I would absolutely take him over the kid from Oregon State. Those are really good football players. And those are guys that are good players too. So I think that's part of it too. And then some of those guys sort of broke out a little bit. Like Fashanu was a guy that was on, it was Alt or Fashanu, right? That's coming into this draft cycle was one of those two guys. And I understood why it was those two guys. And then the kid from Oregon State really had a breakout year. The kid from Washington had a breakout year. Marius Mims got to play a little bit more. People saw his big-time talent. I'm not as sold on him as others just because you have to be able to answer the bell to be an offensive lineman, and he hasn't shown that he can do that with any consistency whatsoever. But I just think it's also partly because there's just other really good tackles in this class. And then the other thing is Joe Alt's been a guy that everybody's known about since he stepped into the starting lineup midway through his freshman year. The fact that he did that at Notre Dame, the fact that he played for Harry Hiestand, the fact that he's a 3-year starter and All-American and all these type of things. His dad played in the NFL. He's been in that spotlight for a couple years now as a potential high draft pick, that we've gotten to the point where it becomes over-analysis. And we see this happen all the time when it comes to draft analysts, because that's who we're talking about, right? We don't know that NFL teams have or haven't had him as the number one the whole time. For all we know, NFL executives, it's been Joe Alt, and it's not even close. It could be somebody else, and it's not even close. And for different teams, it's going to be different. We're talking about draft analysts because those are the people we're responding to. Those are the ones whose opinions we know. And so I think a lot of it, we've seen this from draft analysts, is when the guy's been on the board for a while, we tend to kind of overthink it or overanalyze it. We look for flaws in a guy's game because we've talked so much about him. It's like, how many times can I say this about a guy? And so you kind of look for things to be wrong with them, where the new guy on the block, you're studying his game and you're talking about your likes. And then the last part of it, let's be honest, and this is a small minority, there are some people out there that are just saying things because they don't know what they're talking about. I'm not worried about those people, but there's also people, because you guys, you have to understand, if you're a draft analyst and you're not really well known and you're trying to become well known, just repeating the same things that everybody else is already saying is not going to get you anything. And we've seen this with Notre Dame. We've seen people trying to build their platforms and trying to make a name for themselves will just say all types of outlandish things and report things they shouldn't be reporting, and then act like they're the only ones that know it, when in reality we all knew it, but we're just classy enough not to put it out there because it's not your business to do it. But what happens? Those people's Twitter followings take off, and that's the dopamine hit that they're looking for. And so that's part of it too, is that people are just looking to kind of make names for themselves. And how do you make a name for yourself? Taking an arbitrary view on something that everybody else might agree on. And if you're just going to go out there and say, hey, look, Caleb Williams is the best quarterback prospect in this class. All right. So everybody says that. But if you go out there and say, hey, I don't think Caleb Williams is top 3 top 3 quarterback, and here's why. People are going to kind of make fun of you and laugh at you. Maybe some people will, but they're going to click on it and they're going to read it and they're going to follow, because there's going to always be people kind of looking for those different takes and things like that. So there's just a lot that gets into it, in my opinion, and it's not the same reason for every other person, in my view. But for me, he's the clear, obvious number one. But there's been a couple years recently, and Ryan could probably give you better info, like whether it was 23 or 22, but there's been a couple years recently where the tackle classes have not been strong. This is a really good tackle class, in my opinion. And there's multiple guys that are just like top 15 picks, in my opinion. Like, that guy is a top 15 pick, in my view. That guy's a first-round pick, in my view. And so when that's true, you're going to have more room for debate about, well, I like Joe Alt, but you may like this guy because you care more about the explosive traits, things along those lines. You may care, that may be more important to you than the steadiness that I care about. There's guys in this draft class that have more impressive 2-minute highlight tapes than Joe Alt's 2-minute highlight tape. And some people that they care about that. Other people, like me, I want my left tackle to do his job at a high level every time. Whether he has a snap where he drives a guy 15 yards off the ball or not, I don't care. I want you to do your job and do it well every single snap. Other people care about the upside. And that's why you see guys like Isaiah Wilson get drafted in the first round, because did you see that snap? Boy, that was dominant. Well, I don't care. He's not a very good offensive lineman. Yeah, but did you see that one time he took that SEC defensive lineman and drove him 10 yards off the ball? I don't care. He's not a very good offensive lineman. But they fall in love with the traits. And there's some guys in this draft class that have legitimate traits that I can understand people falling in love with, that could make you have a question about, is Joe Alt really the number one? I don't agree with it. I'm just trying to give some context that not everybody that has an alternate view is doing so only for clicks or for analysis. I do think there's room to have the conversation of, should one guy be better? The only thing that I disagree on is when people feel the need to try to tear Joe Alt down to then build up their guy. Look, if you think Olu Fashanu is the number one tackle in the draft class, state your case. If you think the kid from Oregon State, whose name I have no clue how to pronounce, is the number one tackle in this draft class, cool, state your case. But then don't give me this, well, let me pick apart every bad rep that Joe Alt's ever done. Number one, it's a very short film breakdown. But number two, it's just lazy and unnecessary. Make your case why you think this guy is better. So those are the people that really bother me, are the ones that feel the need to say, oh, he's not that good anyway. Am I the only guy that thinks Joe Alt's not that good? Well, you're the only you're the only person, if you're saying that and you're being serious, you're the only serious person that may be saying that. But there are reasons that people can make a legitimate case for it. Hey, I just like this guy better. Why? State your case. Okay, I get it. Don't agree, but I understand it. Same thing at receiver. I don't think it's open and shut that Marvin Harrison is flat out, no doubt, the best receiver in this draft class. I'm not going to tell you you're nuts for thinking that he is, but I'm also not going to tell you you're nuts if you think Malik Neighbors is, or if you think, hey, I think Rome Odunze may end up being the best receiver in this draft class, or, Brian Thomas is raw now, but he's got this, this, and this. I'll hear those arguments. Those are fun debates to have. But if you're going to then try to tear down Marvin Harrison Jr. and try to convince me that he's not that good because you're a Malik Neighbors guy, I don't want to hear that. Make your case for Malik. Don't try to convince me that something over here is the case when it's not the case, because Marvin Harrison Jr. is an elite prospect. Is he quite what some people make him out to be? I don't think so. I think he's excellent, but I don't think he's generational the way that some people are arguing. I think you can make a case for Malik Neighbors and some other guys. But just don't give me this whole pick apart every aspect about Marvin Harrison's game you don't like, because I promise you I can do the same thing when I'm breaking down Malik Neighbors' film. I promise you I can do the same thing when I'm breaking down Rome Odunze's film, if you're going to come at me with those guys being better prospects. If all you're going to do is just ignore how good of a prospect that Marvin Harrison Jr. is and try to focus on the negatives. We've seen people do that with Caleb Williams. We've seen people do that with Joe Alt. We've seen people do that with Marvin Harrison Jr. And, that's part of the draft. But state your case why you think somebody's better. Tell me why you think this other guy's better. Don't just nitpick this guy's game to get yourself to a preconceived opinion, right? State your case. And those are the people that I listen to. And people I enjoy when it comes to draft. It's good question so far. Coach Koch with a question says, did any of the recent draft selections by the coaches surprise you? KVA got drafted top of the linebacker. So yeah, well, I went back. For some reason I was thinking it was Jalen Sneed, but went back and it was actually Kingston. And it actually makes sense because I mean, I get it. I get it. I think it makes sense. I think that there was sort of a pre. It's just my opinion. I believe there was a bit of a predetermined what we wanted to do. And so the gold team was going to have that linebacking core. Well, they picked first at linebacker, so they're going to take him. And I think that's why we saw the trade with Jalen and Jaden yesterday. But it surprised me a little bit when I'm watching it live. Yeah, it surprised me a little bit. Trying to think some others. It surprised me a little bit when I saw that Rocco Spindler got picked ahead of Pat Coogan. It surprised me a little bit. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But outside of that, there weren't really any big surprises that I saw, knowing what I know. So, yeah, not a ton of surprises, to be completely honest with you. Not a lot of surprises. Irish Gordian Knott says, who is the most important uncommitted recruit on campus this weekend? That's a very good question. Well, if we're going to talk 25 and 26, I'd let me just pull up the visitor list just so I can make sure I'm not forgetting about somebody. My answer is Javon Boggs, but I'm going to just pull up the list. Just because I think right now 25 is more of the focus, and Javon Boggs is really the only 25 kid that's visiting that has an offer that's a top guy, in my opinion. So uncommitted player, I'd say Javon Boggs. I think he's a talented player. He's a Florida kid. He plays at a big-time program. He's a teammate of Brady Hart. That doesn't hurt at all. So I'd say he's probably the guy that would be the biggest name in the most important. It's honestly between us. We'll keep this our little secret. Don't tell anybody. I'm actually not overwhelmed by the blue gold visitor list. And I've had two reactions to that. My first reaction, and Ryan and I were talking about this, looking at the list, I'm like, I love all the committed kids that are coming. Wish a few more were also coming. I'm like, this isn't a knock my socks off visitor list. And that was before some of the kids that were on it decided they're not coming. And I was like, that's a little disappointing and concerning. That's your gut reaction when you see the list. Concerning that there aren't more players. And then I sat and thought about it. I'm like, okay, outside of Dallas Golden, every other top prospect's been on campus recently. The only guy that really surprised me that he's not going to be here is Mark Zachary. And I haven't heard yet why he's not coming this weekend. But I'm like, okay, well, who's left on the board? Number one, you had Josh Petty on campus during the week. That's your only offensive lineman on the board. You had Jane Simon coming in this week, who's your only running back left on the board. You had Javon Boggs visited this week. He's one of your top receivers on the board. Derek Meadows visited, I believe, in March. Let me go look when Derek Meadows was last on campus. Yeah, March 23rd. So he's been on campus recently. He's a kid from Nevada, so it's not real super easy for him to get back on campus again in a month. So you've got your Taylon Taylor's visited, I think, a couple times this spring. You look at the defensive line. I don't know who the heck they're even recruiting on the defensive line, so I don't know who was supposed to visit right now. That's a hot mess. You look at linebacker. Madden Ferry-Emo was just on campus. Noah McHale was just on campus. They're waiting for Nathaniel Usu-Boateng's official till the fall. And so you're looking at all the different players, and I'm thinking to myself, like, well, I understand that it's a disappointing list, but Jadon Blair's been on campus recently. But all these top players that they've brought in before the blue gold game. Well, don't you want them to be part of the pomp and circumstance of the blue gold game? Yeah, to a degree. Tanook Hines was also here recently. It's a good point. Jason Smith, good reminder on that one. But the other part about it to me is when I look at it, it's yes, it's cool to be here for this event, but it's more so when you think about Jadon Blair got a lot more one-on-one time and saw a lot more coaching in the practice that he was at than he's going to see in the blue gold game, which is meant to be fun. yes, the environment's cool, but a lot of these kids have been to games, or you're going to try to get them to games in the fall. So I just think the strategy this year was a little different. It was, let's get these kids up before. A lot of times when these kids were on campus, they were not part of big weekends. They were part of some. I mean, James Simon was the only game in town the 2 days he was on campus from the 25 standpoint. Josh Petty was the only game in town when he was on campus this past week. That was it. You know, Madden Ferrimo, when he was on campus, it was him and Tristan Haynes and then a bunch of Notre Dame commits. That was it. And so what they've decided to do, like it or not, is try to get a lot of these 25 kids on campus by themselves. Tanook Himes was on campus with some talented 26 kids, but he was the only 25 kid on campus that weekend. And so what they've chosen to do, Jadon Blair and Noah McHale were the only big-time 2025 kids on campus when they visited together. So they're focusing on smaller visits, smaller numbers for these top players instead of the big blue gold game. And it seems to me that their focus on the blue gold game is get your commits here. Let's make sure they're all good. Let's have that environment. And then you've got a guy like Javon Boggs who's just going to be surrounded by it. And when you're talking about you've got 19 kids committed, you may take up to 9 more. And all the kids that you want have either visited already or just aren't, you're just not pushing to come on a visit, Nathaniel Usu Boateng, because you understand the circumstance. So I was more comfortable with it once I sat back and thought through it. So, but again, I had the same gut reaction that some other people had about the weekend for it. So it makes your question a lot easier to answer, Irish Gordian Knot, and that it's Javon Boggs, in my opinion. Joe Allen with a question here. He says, what does it tell you about Angeli putting him in a red jersey? It tells me that they don't need to see him in a live setting. He started a bowl game. He has played a certain amount of snaps. He was live last year and the year before. And so it seems that they're following a pattern. When a guy has kind of established himself at quarterback and gets to a certain level of experience, they don't need to put him live in a spring game. CJ Card, Kenny Minchie don't have that experience. So I had somebody say, well, does Steve, friend of mine, we were talking, does Steve being in the red jersey make you think that they think he's ahead of those other guys? Well, we all know that right now he's ahead of those other guys, but that's partly why you want to see those guys live, is because I want to see them in a live bullets type of situation. Whereas Steve Angeli, you've already seen that. Like, what are you going to learn about Steve Angeli in the spring game that you didn't see in the bowl game? Not a lot, right? So, as far as turning him live, there's things that you, as a coach, I want to see him go through his reads and go through his progressions and maybe get to the third guy. But as far as his willingness to take a hit, I know he can play into that pressure. I don't need to see Steve Angeli being pressured by Al Golden's defense in April 20th to know that he can step into a bowl game and lead us to a victory over an Oregon State type of team. So I don't know that there's anything he can show us. There is things that we need to still learn about Kenny Minchie and CJ Carr, and this is their opportunity to go out and shine. That's the way I look at it, without the quick whistle and some of those other things. And then you can learn a little something about him because, it's like we talked about last week in the scrimmage. Like I've said, I wanted to see Kenny and CJ without a red jersey on in this game. I don't care about seeing Steve without a red jersey because, again, if you want to know how Steve Angeli handles pressure from a defense, go watch the Sun Bowl. You have evidence of that. I don't have anything from CJ and Kenny. Now, they both made some gritty throws in the scrimmage on Saturday, but that was when they knew they couldn't get hit. Does CJ step into the pocket and make that going left, throwing to his right, throw to Chris Mitchell that he did last weekend if he knows he can get drilled in the teeth? I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to find that out on Saturday. And so that's what it tells me, is that they have a base level of, we know who Steve Angeli is. We're still learning about Kenny and CJ. That's what it tells me. I don't think it's indicative of Steve has locked down the number 2 quarterback job. I think right now Steve's still the number 2 quarterback. But there's nothing you're going to learn in the spring game that's going to help him solidify that or have him lose that. You're going to try to learn these things about these young quarterbacks. That's what it tells me. Tells me about kind of how they view things. So that's a good question, Joe. Got a question from John A1. Does hiring an assistant coach's son show any nepotism within the staff? I'm assuming you're talking about Dylan McCullough's kid. I'm assuming that's the only Notre Dame example I could talk about, but I do know that there's been other examples. I mean, is it nepotism by the very textbook definition? Probably. Is it nepotism in a way that I find to be problematic? No, I can't say that either because I don't know. I'll just use Coach McCullough's son because I believe he's doing things within the program. I don't know if it's official or unofficial, but I don't know what he brings to the table. I don't know what he's capable of, and for all I know, he's a guy that's more than capable of doing a job. He played, I believe, Division I football, and so I don't think like, and it's more so from a political standpoint, really from a coaching standpoint. But like, I never had a problem with Charlie Weiss allowing his kid to be around. Well, that's it's unfair. It's his kid. And if that helps him, maybe become a better coach than some other people, I'm not going to punt. Like we shouldn't just arbitrarily reward people for just being someone's kid. Like you got into Yale or Harvard because you were so and so's kid, and you just drank yourself into oblivion for 4 years and got C's. That doesn't mean you should become president someday. Just hypothetically speaking, doesn't mean you're qualified to have that job. That's nepotism. You know, uh, your dad being a football coach and then you wanting to be a football coach, you shouldn't get a job just because you're that guy's son, but you also should not get an opportunity because you're someone's son. You know what I mean? So like, I think we can kind of go too far. If, hey, that's his son and he happens to also be really smart and really capable and really competent and he can benefit us, then sure, go ahead and do it. Now, would he have that job if his dad wasn't on staff? And this just hypothetically, maybe not, probably not, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's nepotism in a way that I think we would look at it from a negative viewpoint. Is it nepotism from the very, very textbook definition of it? Probably. But I really don't have a look. As long as people are qualified and competent, I don't think we should punish them because of who their parents are. And I don't think, just like I don't think we should push people who are not competent or qualified just because of who their parents are. You should get it on your merit. And sometimes there are things about you that can get your foot in the door in a way that maybe someone like me, whose dad drove a UPS truck for 20 years, doesn't get his foot in the door. So that's part of it. That's part of life. So what are you going to make of it? Are you going to take advantage of that opportunity? And when you get your foot in the door because of who your dad is, do you work your butt off? Do you do a great job? Or do you have the right attitude? Are you a learner? Are you someone who's coachable? Are you someone who will, hey, coach, whatever you want me to do, I'll do it? Are you good at your job? Those are the things I care about. Whatever got your foot in the door, hey, God bless you. You were forced in that situation, but you got to now go make the most of it. I have no problem with that. Now, if you get bring a coach's kid in, and he has this sense of entitlement, well, this is who my dad is. You can't tell me nothing, or I'm this person. You can't tell. I don't want to hear anything from you. You're just some dude. No, I don't have time for that. Get out of here. So I think it's about whatever gets your foot in the door. So be it. God bless you. It's what do you do with that opportunity that I care more about, to be completely honest with you. And look, and like I said, my dad being a UPS truck driver my whole life was not going to get me certain opportunities in certain fields. So what? It's the lessons I got taught by my dad that gave me the tools I needed to then go be successful. And hey, you get kicked down, you don't have success, get back up and keep fighting. That's the lessons I learned. Now, I could have had a dad that got my foot in the door, but if he didn't teach me those lessons, then I don't give a rip if I didn't get my foot in the door, because I wouldn't have been prepared to be successful. And that's ultimately what truly matters, is what do you do with that opportunity? And we'll find out, because we've seen coaches' kids kind of get like, if Lane Kiffin's dad wasn't Monty Kiffin, does Lane Kiffin have the opportunities at the age he got those? Probably not. Does that change the fact that Lane Kiffin's one of the best offensive minds in the game? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And so I think he's earned that opportunity. There's other, kids of coaches who maybe shouldn't have got some of those opportunities. But look, there's clearly people see things in, like Charlie Weiss Jr., for example, that have allowed him to get some really good opportunities. I don't think Lane Kiffin's doing that as some favor to Charlie Weiss Sr. It means he sees something in Charlie Weiss Jr. Now, did Charlie Weiss Jr. get some advantages that most kids didn't have, being on a Notre Dame sideline, having his dad? Sure. But look what he's doing with that opportunity. He's thriving with it. Good for him. Good for him. I'm all about that. Got a question here from Ballpeen Shalala. Actually, kind of a two-part question here. Appreciate this one. And it says, part one, quarterback success is sometimes predictable, but usually difficult. Bama had pretty good quarterbacks under Saban, but the past few years have been lackluster. Then there's smaller teams who develop, like Riley Leonard and Will Howard, who aren't superstars, but ended up more successful than much higher ranked recruits. What all goes into QB success and why is it so difficult to predict? That's a really good question. There's several things. Number one, kids develop. This is very general. Kids develop at different stages. There are some kids who people look back and say, "Boy, that guy just didn't pan out." I'm like, "Well, that's true. He was overrated." Well, we're talking about two different things. A guy can be rated just fine, not pan out, and it doesn't change that he was rated just fine because at that time that he was the best or he was this kind of player. But some guys get to college and they don't get any bigger, they don't get a lot stronger, and they don't get any faster. And some kids can actually slow down as they physically mature. That's just life. And some kids show up to college 240 pounds and their bodies develop differently. Next thing you know, they add 80 pounds, they're 300 plus pounds, they're still athletic, and they take off. And so that's part of it too, is just guys develop differently. Guys age differently. I've seen offensive linemen show up as true freshmen and they've got full beards and they look like 30-year-olds. Then I see Joe Alt show up on campus, and if you just look at him in the face, he looks like he's 13 years old. The guys just they just mature differently. And so, I just think that's kind of part of it. And in quarterbacks, it's no different. Some guys are just fully developed by the time they're juniors in high school. They got big arms and all these kind of things, but they don't get any better, and everybody kind of catches up to them. There's other things that show up when it comes to the star system and the ranking system that I think are more about flaws in that system than anything else. And those are scenarios to me where you don't always know about a guy just from studying film or what he is as a prospect or at 7-on-7s and things along those lines, because there's so many things that go into it that you can't even evaluate on film. You can't evaluate on film, a guy's mental toughness. He may seem to be mentally tough in high school, but when a guy's super talented, he's never really been challenged. When a guy's 6'5" and 225 and has a big arm and he runs a 4.5, you're only going to get challenged so much in high school. You're going to get to college and realize, like, hey, I was pretty unique in high school, but I'm not that unique in college. A perfect example is a guy like Terrell Pryor. Was Terrell Pryor a phenomenal high school football player? Yeah. Was he a phenomenal college player? Not at all, because Terrell didn't want to do the things that were needed to maximize his ability. Now, there were red flags about him in high school that some people missed. And I could share some of those that I saw firsthand, maybe to tailgate one of these days. But there were things about him, attitude-wise, personality-wise, that were just going to make it difficult for him to really take what he was in high school and develop that and be kind of that guy in college. A guy like Vince Young was very similar to Terrell Pryor in high school, but Vince took advantage of it and was able to take that to the next level. Some guys just get to college and their ability to process things just isn't that good. Big arm, all that kind of stuff, their ability to process isn't that good. Some guys get ranked high coming out of high school because they happen to have a trait that people put value on, but in the end of the day, it's really not one that makes you a great quarterback or not. I mean, I still have to listen to it, and I love how this drives Ryan nuts, but I'll still have to listen to people talk about Joe Milton's arm talent. And there's a major lack of understanding of what arm talent means with some people that view themselves as analysts. Arm strength alone does not equal arm talent. There's so many things that come into that, and some guys just don't have that. Jamarcus Russell should never have been the number one overall draft pick. He was big, he was strong, and he had a cannon. But it didn't take very much film breakdown, in my opinion, to realize this guy struggles with reading defenses. And then you hear about some of the things about him. You're like, you fell in love with the wrong things. And it's not a shock. Like, there's some guys that are like, man, I thought that guy was going to be a lot better. And then there's other guys you were like, yeah, that was obvious to anyone that guy was not going to be who you thought he was. And he still developed better. So I think there's a lot of those things that go into it. Some of it's system fit. Some guys go into a college and boy, they're just playing in the perfect system or they're in the right situation and it works out really well for them. Where if this kid would have gone somewhere else, maybe it worked out better. I've said this and I'll take this to my grave. If Ronald Curry would have gone to Florida State or Michigan and just played football instead of going to North Carolina to do both and play for Carl Torbush and do both, I think his career would have been completely different. I think he would have been everything that Michael Vick was. I think Ronald Curry would have been. I watched those two guys in the same high school conference, and there was a reason nobody ever heard of Michael Vick because that's how good Ronald Curry was. Now, some people from locally say, well, that's because Michael Vick played on a much more loaded team. True, but I'm just telling you, I saw both of those kids with my own eyes, and I was a year older than both of them, so they were contemporaries of mine. And I was actually talking about this at the grocery store yesterday. Yeah, a friend of Vince and I actually were talking about this. It's kind of funny how, every kid that thinks he's something special needs that wake-up call. And I told him mine was, look, I'd been to camps at Michigan. I'd been to camps at NC State. I'd been recruited by Division I teams. I'd gotten handwritten letters from Florida State, NC State, teams like that. And I was like, man, I should be getting recruited by better schools. I'm not getting enough, real interest in some of these schools. I should be. And then we had a bye week. And I went and watched Ronald Curry play. And I was like, yeah, I'm not that good. I'm just like, that was my wake up call. And I'm like, this guy is unbelievable. And if this is the standard for what this is going to be, then that's not me. I'm more of an FCS guy or that kind of thing is kind of what I thought. So he was just incredible, but he made a choice on where he went to school that completely stunted his development and kept him from ever being the player he could have been. That's pure, projection, pure conjecture, because I don't know that he would have been that, but I believe that. So that's another factor that goes into it. I've said this. I don't know that David Carr or Derek Carr would have ever been a great NFL quarterback. I liked a lot of what I saw from him at Fresno State. Should he have been the number 1 overall pick? No. Could he have been a guy that had more success in the NFL had he not gone to Houston and gotten his brains beat in his first few years? I believe so. I think so. So that's part of it too, is fit. Do you make the right decisions? Do you go to the right places? I've used this with Notre Dame before. I've said this about Rick Meyer and Ron Paulus. If they would have not gone to Notre Dame, maybe they would have been better prepared to get to the NFL and have success. There's all types of things. David Carr is the older one, right? David's the older one. It's the older one that played for the Texans, David. So I always get those two confused, but those are, so again, there's ball peen, there's all types of factors that go into it. Like with Riley Leonard, for example, his is a little bit more unique because for a while there, people viewed him more as a basketball recruit than necessarily a football recruit. He was just an athlete playing quarterback in high school. He gets to college and all of a sudden the other parts of his game start to develop, and then he kind of takes off as a quarterback. So it's not that necessarily, like I've gone back and looked at Riley Leonard's film from high school, and you're like, okay, he should have been higher ranked than he was. Like Riley Leonard should not have been a 3-star recruit coming out of high school. But I also don't look back on it and say, Riley Leonard should have been a 5-star and a potential first-round draft pick projection, because he wasn't. He wasn't that then. He became that, but he wasn't then. Should he have been a 4-star? Yes. You could argue maybe top 250 player. Absolutely. Would I say that this is a guy that's going to be a future first-round draft pick? No, and he may still not be, but that's been what some people have said he could be. So that's where I say before, again, sometimes guys just develop differently. I don't think Will Howard's that good, to be honest with you. I really don't. I'm not a huge Will Howard fan. I think he's a good athlete. I don't think he's that great of a player. For me, it's more about, I just think he was in a really good system that fit his skill set. I don't think, and I think that's a part of it too. So I actually don't think that Will Howard's that good of a player. He's okay. I think his thing is more about he went to the right system and was with the right program and got the right coaching. So Kansas State got everything out of Will Howard that they could get out of Will Howard. And I think Ohio State's learning now this spring that, wow, this guy doesn't process and doesn't throw the way that we had hoped he would be able to throw. And that's why, depending on who you talk to, there's some people think that Julian Sainz got a legitimate shot to beat him out. because I just don't think he was that good. But then there are other guys that were lower ranked that came out of nowhere. CJ Stroud was a guy that ended up being ranked high, but coming into his senior year, like as a junior, he wasn't thought of as high. He was kind of a little bit of a late bloomer. Guys just develop differently. And that's just, those are all things to me that factor into why, some guys pan out, some guys don't. There's no one reason. There's lots of reasons why, and it's different for every kid. But to me, those are some of the reasons that go into why some kids end up panning out and some don't. And sometimes it's not a coaching mistake. Some kids just don't want it. They don't want to be great. They're entitled. They want things to be given to them. They think they should be starters day one, whether they earn it or not. They think they should be allowed to throw X amount of times, whether they've earned it or not. There's that as well. And I think there's more entitlement now amongst recruits and high school players than there was before, but there's always been a sense of entitlement. It's just now, because of all the platforms that kids have to get that exposure, you're now seeing in football what's been true in basketball for my entire life. I mean, football players, five-star football recruits would get some of that love, but it was so much easier to do it with basketball players because it's an individual sport much more so than it is in football from a recruiting standpoint, and so those are different things that factor into it. Really good question. We've got some super chats I want to get to as we kind of transition into sort of hour two of today's podcast. I want to get to those real quick. Thank you guys for the super chats. Tyler Longbreak asked, how would you take who would you take in the 26 QBs? Any interest on how Notre Dame views them after the visits? I know there are a few California quarterbacks in the mix too. Really, right now, what it really comes down to, in my opinion, it really comes down to two guys. It really comes down to Brady Hart and Noah Grubbs. Yes, the staff is still recruiting Ryder Lyons to a degree. I believe they like him. I don't know that they're willing to wait on him as long as I think his recruitment is going to play out, nor do I believe they view him as better than those other guys. The way that the Notre Dame staff view quarterback in this class is there was 4 guys that they really liked a lot, and they were going to take any of those 4 guys. One of those kids committed to Georgia recently. Ryder Lyons is another, and then Brady Hart and Noah Grubbs are the other 2. They like those guys more than some players that are more highly ranked, like the Smigel kid from California. They like Troy Hahn, they like Brady, but they don't view them as the same as these other kids. That's just the reality of it. It comes down to Brady Hart, Noah Grubbs, and who wants to come first, and I'm okay with that. I have a preference on who's better now, who has more upside, all those type of things. But you're in a situation with those players where it's like you're in a win-win. I've tried to explain this to a friend of mine. He is really on the Brady Hart bandwagon, and I'm for it. I think Brady Hart's probably my number one guy. But at the same time, if Noah Grubbs called tomorrow and said he wanted to come and Notre Dame took that, what I say, that's a mistake. You shouldn't take that kid. Not at all. Because I also think Noah Grubbs is a really good player. The reason I like Brady Hart better is because I think Brady Hart has better projection as a mover at the next level, which fits more of what Mike Denbrock wants to do. I like Noah Grubbs's pocket movement, his footwork, as far as being able to slide step, spin, throw. He shows me some good things, but it's all as a passer. He's not a kid that I view as having the chance to kind of get to the next level and do some damage with his legs as a mover. And that's really what separates the two for me. But I would take either one of those kids in a heartbeat. I believe Notre Dame would take the first of those guys that wants to come. Because again, they're both excellent prospects. And you can't go wrong with either one. You want the guy that wants to be here. That's the key. That's the win, is get the guy that wants to be here. And as long as you're able to do that, it's a win. So I would take either one of those guys. If Ryder Lyons wanted to call tomorrow and said he wanted to come and those other 2 guys weren't ready to make a decision, I'd take him too. They're all really good prospects. You can debate who's 1, 2, and 3, and it's a very fair debate to have, and some people are going to have it differently. But in some years, you do have a quarterback someone. For example, there was other quarterbacks in CJ Carr's class that Tommy Reese liked, but he was not going to make a move on any of them until he knew whether they were or weren't going to get CJ. Now, of course, they were able to zero in on CJ being the guy, and he liked them pretty early, but that was the reality. They were not going to move on anybody else. The same way the year before with Dante Moore. And there was a clear difference, in my opinion, between Dante and the next guys on the board. There was a very clear difference between CJ and the next guys on the board. This year, it's a little bit different because they all are kind of close together. And so I don't think it makes as much sense to wait on your top guy, even if you have one, until he decides before you move on these others, because they're all so close. It's, look, whoever wants to be part of this Notre Dame program, whoever wants to be the leader of this class, that's the guy you take. That's the guy you take. And that's the guy that Notre Dame fans should embrace, because that's the guy that truly wanted to be here. And we're going to find out who that is. I think we're going to find out that answer before the end of the summer. I'd be a little surprised if we don't find that answer out before the end of the summer, to be completely honest with you. But stranger things have happened. Charlie Weiss's last belt, a little bit of super chat. Thank you, Charlie, very much for that. Hey, Coach, when does Marcus Freeman step in on D-line recruiting? Is he happy about where things are? Just feels like the D-line needs to get some dogs. D-line recruiting at Notre Dame is a topic that it's almost impossible to have a rational conversation about. Because what happens is Al Washington has become a polarizing figure. And in some regards, I understand it. He frustrates me sometimes, just incredibly so, because there's just some unforced errors as a recruiter and some very weird evaluations. And so people get unhappy with decisions that I believe he's made. Not pushing for Jarquez Carter, not pushing for Marco Jones, not pushing for Javion Campbell. Those are all, to me, evaluation mistakes, recruiting mistakes. And so people will jump on that, rightfully so. And I've had people say this: he's not winning any big battles on recruiting. I'm like, hold on a second. See, now you forced me into I've got to defend Al Washington mode, because if we're going to have this conversation, we need to have the conversation honestly, because they flat out beat Michigan and Ohio State for Christopher Burgess. That was a huge recruiting win, a huge recruiting win. Getting Davion Dixon out of the South when he has offers from Florida schools is a very good recruiting win. So you can't tell me that he misses out on his top guys. No, he doesn't. Logan Thomas was one of their top guys. They wanted him early on, and they got that win. They got Bryce Young. Now, he benefited from the fact that that's Bryan Young's kid. I get all that. I don't disagree with that. And there's a lot he has to prove. But what's happening is we're now basically, some of us are ignoring the wins and only focusing on the mistakes. And that's a problem. So the wins are good, but that's also, for me, what makes it so frustrating. Because you had a chance to have a really dynamic defensive line class. You had a chance to have Christopher Burgess, which was a big win. You had a chance to have Davion Dixon, which was a big win. You had a chance to have Joseph Reif, who I like a lot, and then also have potentially a Marco Jones and a Javion Campbell, or maybe it's just one of those guys. You had a chance to have some other players, and you just chose to go in a different direction, which I think is a mistake. And it's frustrating. Is it to the point where Marcus Freeman has to step in? I don't know. I don't know. Like, I don't talk to Marcus Freeman. Like, I don't like I knew him and we would talk when he was an assistant coach. We don't really have that relationship that he's a head coach where I can just call him up and say, hey man, can you tell me what's going on with this? I'm not going to get any answers to that. He's not going to tell me that. I don't know if he feels it that way. Do I think he needs to kind of sit down and have a conversation with the defensive line coach and the rest of the recruiting staff to have a clue what the heck are we doing? What's our plan? Yeah, that I think needs to happen. I've had people say, should he override Al Washington and make them take Marco Jones? No, can't do that. And it's very simple, because if I go out and get a kid that I know my position coach doesn't want, then guess what? We're going to have a hard time treating that kid the right way and giving that kid a fair chance. I've said this before. I believe there's one defensive lineman on the current team that's not getting a fair shake because I don't think he was a guy that the current defensive line coach wanted. I could be wrong. That's my read on it. I don't know that I know enough about it to definitively say it for sure, but I have a strong inclination that that's the case. So you can't do that. And you could say, well, find a new D-line coach. Well, yeah, but didn't we just watch the D-line coach do a pretty darn good job coaching the D-line last year? Like, we can't value recruiting so much that we ignore that a guy's a pretty darn good coach. That was a knock on Chris O'Leary. And people would say, got to move on from Chris O'Leary. Well, how about we just work on making him a better recruiter? Because the guy's a pretty freaking good position coach. And that's the thing with Al Washington is I think Al Washington has shown himself to be a pretty good defensive line coach. I think that there's some decisions he's made on who he likes and doesn't like that I don't think are right. And I think that's where you need to manage the situation. I think with defensive line recruiting for me, I would have this approach. Like, look, man, we need to kind of have some more conversations. You got to convince me, why you do or don't like a guy to make sure that there's some soundness to that decision. But at the end of the day, if a guy doesn't want to coach a guy, you can't force him to coach a guy. And I don't like it, and it doesn't seem fair. And you say, well, you can fire him then. Well, I promise you, whoever they replace him with is going to have that with some kids as well. That's life. That's coaching. You're just going to have coaches that, for whatever reason, like or don't like certain players. And for Al Washington, maybe this reason. For Mike Elson, it may be a different reason. For whoever the next D-line coach is going to be at Notre Dame, it's going to be for a different reason. That's life, and you're always going to have those questions. You're always going to have those concerns. You're always going to have that debate, that evaluation. Teresa, hey, this guy's wrong. He should like that guy. And we'll have that debate here. But if you just say, hey, we're going to move on from Al Washington, we're going to fire Al Washington and bring somebody else in, guess what we're going to be doing at this time next year? We're going to be talking about a D-line evaluation we don't like because we are not cult members and we don't worship at the feet of any human at Irish Breakdown. We give you our opinions, and we understand that coaches make mistakes, even great ones make mistakes. Urban Meyer, for all his success, 3 national titles, thought it was a good idea to have Tim Beck and Ed Warner as his offensive coordinators in 2016. Horrible, horrible decision. Now, he moved on from it quickly, but he thought that was a smart idea. I don't think it was a smart idea. We've seen great coaches always make mistakes, but you learn from them and you move on. And so there will be times that whoever the next D-line coach is, we're going to disagree with him about some things too. The frustrating thing about Al Washington is there's too many of them, in my opinion. I don't know what to do about it, though. I just think he's a little bit kind of all over the place. There's no rhyme or reason to what he's doing. And so it's hard for me to say this is how you fix it because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's some evaluations he's made that maybe some other people don't like that I've liked. I like the Joseph Reif evaluation. I really do. I liked his Cole Mullins evaluation coming out of high school. I thought that was a really good evaluation. I have no clue his Marco Jones evaluation makes no sense to me whatsoever. Don't get it at all. His Javion Campbell evaluation doesn't make any sense at all to me. None. No clue why he would see it that way. And that's the frustrating part. But, is it time for Marcus Freeman to step in? Yeah, sure. He should always have a role in that. I don't know what you can do. About it. If he doesn't like a kid, maybe try to convince him to like a kid, but that's just not how coaching works. And you can't just, if you fired every coach that for whatever reason liked or didn't like a player, you'd literally have no coaches left. No one ever would have coaches left. That's just human nature. I don't care what anybody says. You can say whatever you want. Look, there's just, I'm not a parent, but I know lots of parents, and you may love all your kids differently or equally. But do you have the same relationship with all your kids? No. Do you have the same level of trust with all of your kids? No. Is it always the same? Could one kid maybe do something another kid can't? I've experienced that, but there's reasons for it. And it is what it is. So you deal with it and you say, okay, is he overall doing a good enough job? In a lot of ways, Al Washington's doing a great job. In a lot of ways, he's not doing a good enough job. And it's up to Marcus Freeman to figure out how do we get him to that level in all areas. That's going to be the key. I don't know how to do that. I'm not there enough every day to on this particular one to know how to do that. But I understand the frustration. I just want us to be able, because like this is what's going on the board. Anytime Al Washington's name comes up, there's one of two sides. There's the people that will defend everything he does and he's perfect and he never makes a mistake. And on the other side, there's people that just, no matter what he does, are going to bash him. I had somebody yesterday, a 26 defensive lineman decided to not visit this weekend. Most likely, same reason as every kid that doesn't come to spring game for any school. Travel plans just didn't work out. And it was first response, something has to be done about this. And I'm like, what? Like, it's because it's Al Washington. I'm like, okay, well, there's a cornerback that's much better than the D lineman that had to cancel that also canceled this week. Should we move on from Mike Mickens? Because that was the implication. No, we like Mike Mickens, so we're not going to say that about him. Well, then apply the same standard to Al Washington, meaning when he does something that's wrong, criticize him for that. Don't invent stuff to hammer him for. Like a 26 kid cancels the week of the spring game of visiting for an unofficial visit that happens to every team everywhere. That happened to Mike Mickens like the day before, or maybe it was the day of. And so that's the frustrating thing is we're incapable with certain coaches, and Brian Kelly was this way. I don't know that I had more than a handful of rational conversations about, and Vince will tell you this because he was a part of a lot of those. I could count maybe on one, maybe two hands the number of rational conversations I had with people about Brian Kelly. Because what happened was people just fell on one of two sides. He's the Antichrist and should be fired as the coach, or he's the all-time winningest coach who never's done anything wrong and we should support him no matter what. It was almost impossible to have anything in between. And so when I would be critical of Brian Kelly, this side hated my guts. And when I was praised Brian Kelly, this other side hated I literally have people, true to this day. This is the funniest thing. Vince actually is helping in the back end. Vince will get a kick out of this because he knows what I'm talking about. I have people to this day that dislike me and won't read my site because they think I'm a Brian Kelly apologist. True story. Because I said good things about Brian Kelly in certain situations. Because I don't know that there's any coach that is only can say that. Brian Van Gorder is probably the closest thing to it. Where he said only negative things about it. There's always going to be good and bad. What drives me nuts is when you fall into that camp where you're going to ignore the good things a coach does and only hammer him for the bad things, or you're going to ignore the bad things and only focus on the good things. And then those two sides just start lobbing grenades at each other all the time. And that's what it's turned into with Al Washington. It's almost impossible to have a rational conversation about Al Washington. I thought Sean and Ryan did as good of a job as you can do in that regard. It's more so, it's not them that I'm talking about. It's more so just the debate in the open platforms and on the boards. It's just impossible to have that rational conversation because there's some really good things that Al Washington has done. And if you can't see that, then you're blind to it. You've created a bias that's preventing you from seeing those good things. If you're someone that's completely unwilling to say that's a bad decision or that's not a good enough job, then again, you have a bias built up that makes it impossible for you to see what's clearly there. And I just wish we could have more of those conversations. I have another super chat from Iden Benami. Thank you, Iden. Has Mike Denbrock told Marcus Freeman we can't play not to lose yet? Probably not. I don't know why he would tell Marcus Freeman that. I don't understand. I don't understand where you're coming from with the question. I didn't love you, man, but I don't understand the question. I don't understand that one. You have to explain that to me. But I would hope that he wouldn't say that to him because I don't think that's Marcus Freeman's personality, and I don't think the talent that they're going to have this year is going to make anyone want to do that. So it doesn't make a lot of sense why he would say that to him. So maybe you could explain that one to me a little bit. So, Different Aisle says, Iden is saying Marcus Freeman coaches conservatively in big games. I don't necessarily agree with that. Yeah, I don't agree with that. Again, I think people equate running the football with being conservative. I don't think there's anything conservative about Notre Dame's game plan against Clemson in 2022. They're a top 5 team. They didn't throw the ball a whole lot, but they were very creative in the run game. They were very aggressive in special teams. They were very aggressive on defense. they were conservative on offense because they had an offense that demanded you be conservative on offense. Were you going to drop back and throw the ball 40 times against Ohio State in 2022? Were you going to do that against Clemson in 2022? Or were you going to build around your strengths as a team, which is a pretty good defense and what was supposed to be a good offensive line and good special teams? What were you going to build around in 2022? So you're sometimes a victim of your reality. And your reality is that you can't go out there and open things up and let it loose because you don't have the personnel to do that. And there were times we saw that this year. Are there moments that I would have said, hey, I would have liked to be more aggressive here? Were there moments that I felt that they don't turn it loose? Yeah, I think so, absolutely. But for whatever reason, Marcus Freeman had a lack of faith in that situation of that side of the ball. I don't think you hire Mike Denbrock as your offensive coordinator if that's your goal, if that's your end game, if you want to be that guy. I also don't think Marcus Freeman had some giant revelation in 2023 that, gee, if I don't open the offense up, we're going to struggle, like I believe that Ed Orgeron had after 2018 when his job was on the line. I think Marcus Freeman hasn't had faith in his specific offenses to the degree that he wants to allow them to really turn it loose in those situations. But I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that. So if you are correct that what he's saying, then I would say I don't agree with that premise. I think that the fact that he tried to hire Andy Ludwig, you don't hire Andy Ludwig if you want to be conservative. He's a very creative coach. You don't hire Mike Denbrock if you're someone who wants to be conservative. And so the very hiring him alone should answer that question. He doesn't need Mike Denbrock to tell him that. And if he had to tell Mike Denbrock that, if Mike Denbrock had to tell Marcus Freeman that, I promise you Mike Denbrock wouldn't be here. Guys, they coached together for 4 years. He knows Marcus Freeman. Knows Marcus Freeman better than any of us do. If he felt that, he would not be there. He would have taken the Texas A&M job. If he didn't want to be at LSU anymore, he'd have taken the A&M job because he knows Mike Elko's not going to be that way. So that's kind of where I'm at on that. So if that's where he was coming from, I understand it. I just don't necessarily agree with the premise on that one. I have another super chat from Maltavius. Thank you for this one. Bryan, under the radar player to watch, out for the spring game. See you tomorrow. You nerds. Drive safe, my man. Hashtag IB Nation is what Maltavius had there. Under the radar player to watch. I kind of already said it earlier, and I'm going to stick with this one, man. I'm going to roll with this one. It's KK Smith. And I said this in the breakdown yesterday. You know, there's different ways to look at things, and there's people that literally think that Notre Dame is purposely sabotaging Kenny Minchey by giving him the offensive players that he has. And I just think that's just I'll just say I'm in a good mood today. So I'm going to say it's misguided. But I'm like, look, Micah Gilbert was the number one boundary receiver in the scrimmage last week. And KK Smith is a guy that I reported a week ago was having a breakout spring. And so I don't think – and they gave him the number one healthy tight end right now in Cooper Flanagan, and they gave him the best offensive line of the two groups. So I think he's doing just fine. But I think this is a great opportunity for KK Smith to go out there and kind of prove himself that, hey, I got a chance to go do something. So keep an eye on KK. If the offensive line can give Kenny time to throw tomorrow, him and KK are going to connect, I have no doubt, on some balls. And I think people are like, man, this KK Smith kid can play. If I had to make a prediction about tomorrow, that's what I would do. That's what I would do that. So I'm gonna go with KK Smith as my under the radar player to watch, because we don't talk about him a lot at receiver because the higher ranked guys, Jaden Greathouse is in his class, and Jordan Faison broke out last year, and Chris Mitchell's a veteran who had 1,000 yards, and Bo Collins is a big name guy that's gonna had production and is gonna be a good player in my opinion at Notre Dame, and so KK was hurt all year last year, out of sight, out of mind. But I'm telling you, I've liked what I've seen from him this spring, and I won't be shocked if he has a little bit of a who is that guy? Some who is that guy moments from fans tomorrow. Who's number 11? And you're going to see people looking at their rosters, looking on the line, going to Irish Breakdown and trying to find my roster. Who's number 11? That kid's balling. That's KK Smith. So I'm just going to help you all out in advance. If you're trying to wonder who number 11 is tomorrow, it's KK Smith. I think he'd be my pick for breakout for tomorrow. Under the radar breakout for tomorrow. So that's all the super chat. So let's get back to the top of the board. Coach Koch says, could the staff look at moving someone to the tight end room for depth? Lots of injuries there. Well, coach, I think with the way that they look at it, there's really only one injury there right now that is related to a guy that they have plans for. I think if Kevin Bauman's ever healthy enough to play again, it's just an added bonus. I don't think there's any attempt at building the roster around the hope that Kevin Bauman's going to be healthy next year. Mitchell Evans, there is. Eli Raridan, there is. And Mitchell right now is the only one who's injured. With Eli, he's not injured anymore. They're just like they are doing with Riley Mills and Howard Cross, is they're just limiting his spring reps to make sure that there aren't any setbacks. So he's healthy when we get to the fall because they know what he can do. And I think there's some savviness to that decision. But I think you also have to look at it and say, but he does have an injury history. He's had multiple season-ending injuries. Mitchell Evans has had multiple injuries that have caused him to miss games throughout his career. And so in that regard, yeah, I could see that. And so there's a couple things to do. You could, number one, you could just really keep working on getting Henry Garrity and Jack Larson ready. That's number one. Number two is you could look to the portal for a depth guy in the portal. Don't know how well that's going to go. And then number three is your suggestion, which is move someone. And I would consider that, especially with here's what I would do, honestly. If I was Mike Denbrock, and of course they also have Davis Sherwood as well. If I was Mike Denbrock, I would sit down and have a conversation with Al Golden and Marcus Freeman and Max Bulla about kind of seeing if I could take Preston Zinner over. That's what I would do. Because I really like Preston as an H-back, and he brings a little bit of a different element. Like he would be a completely different type of player than what Eli Raridan or Cooper Flanagan are for you, or Mitchell Evans are for you, or what James Flanagan will be for you. He's more of a true H-back type player. And I liked him coming out of high school there. I like him at linebacker too, but the thing is it's me moving Preston is not a situation where I don't think he can play linebacker or that I don't think he's capable of being a starter. Preston Zinner has more God-given ability than guys that we've seen start at Notre Dame at linebacker in the last decade. He's a talented kid. The problem is he's happens to be at Notre Dame when this is the most depth they've had in 20 years at linebacker from just a athleticism and just raw talent standpoint. Somebody that I graded as a four-star player, multiple somebodies that I graded as a four-star player are going to be on the third string next year linebacker. There's literally mathematically no way that's not going to be true unless a bunch of dudes transfer and they don't have a third team. It's literally not possible. And you could even take it as not my grade. You could say it as that someone graded as a four-star, because I believe Preston Zinner was graded as a four-star by at least one entity. And I believe Bodie Cahoon was graded as a four-star by at least one entity as well. I'm actually going to pull that up right now. Of course, I have to put on my glasses or I won't be able to read it because the computer screen is too blurry when I don't have them on. But Rivals ranked Bodie Cahoon as a four-star player. So the only guys that they're going to have next year on their entire depth chart that at linebacker that no recruiting service ranked as a four-star player is going to be Teddy Rizak, because 247 Sports had Jack Kaiser as a top 200 player. So, and that includes Preston, because I think ESPN and Rivals both had him as a four-star player. Let me look that up. But I graded him as a four-star player, top 150-ish, 200, I believe, is where I had Preston Zinner coming out of high school. Let me go look at that. So, and I know at least one other service had Preston as a four-star. So ESPN is who had him as a four-star. Rivals at one point had him as a top 250 player, and for some inexplicable reason dropped him even from being a four-star, which makes no sense to me, but whatever. It is what it is. But yeah, he's a guy to me that I view as they had him as highest number as 214 in February of 2022. He was even ranked in the top 250 as late as July of 2022. And for some inexplicable reason, they dropped him. So whatever. It is what it is. But ESPN someone as a four-star. So I'd say, look, man, it's not that you can't play. We love you. We think you can play. But we think you can maybe help us over here more. And you could find that niche role over there more. And then it could still help you on special teams. So that, to answer your question, Coach, I would absolutely do that. I would absolutely, if I'm Mike Denbrock. And it's not just to protect yourself from depth, because I'm not a big fan of moving guys and then not playing them. Like, I really dislike the notion that they moved Brennan Vernon from big end to 3 technique and then buried him at the bottom of the depth chart. Why move him at all? If he's going to move, if you're going to bury him at the bottom of your depth chart, then leave him at the position he wants to play. What's the point of moving him to the inside where, and then just you're putting a 245-pound kid ahead of him? If you don't think the kid can play and you don't want to coach him up or whatever, just leave him at the position he wants to play at. I'm not a big fan of moving guys just for depth if they have a shot to play somewhere. And Preston Zinner will have a shot to play at Notre Dame at linebacker if he continues at it. I would imagine that he'd be a guy that if I'm Al Washington and I need help at Viper, he's a guy that I would consider, let's see if we can maybe get him down to Viper. But if I'm Mike Denbrock, I would absolutely 100% have that conversation with Marcus Freeman first and then with the defensive staff. Hey, can we get 25 over here because we think this kid can play for us? We think this kid can help us as an H-back type of player. I would absolutely do that. So, and then that would solidify your depth chart. It would, but it would also give you a good football player, because I think Freeman I think Preston Zinner is a good football player. Thought I had muted myself in time for that. I apologize. It's got a question here from Irish Gordian Knott. Notre Dame seems deep at almost every position this year. What will the weakest position group be on the team? That is a really good question. So if we're talking position group, then it can't be like right tackle, like I said the other day. It can't be something like that. It'd have to be like an entire room. I would say that right now, and I don't even want to say the weakest, because I don't think Notre Dame has a weak spot unless we're just talking relative to other spots. There's not a position on the team where I'm like, that's a major weakness. And we have seen this in past years. Cornerback in 2020 was a weakness relative to, are you trying to win a championship? But just a spot that could be problematic in your attempt to go win a championship, I think you still have to look at safety. Look, a quarterback, you could argue on offense, is the biggest weakness on offense because of the fact of you have an injured guy who's your starter, and then you have a lot of unproven aspects to what's behind it. So it's more of a question mark. Running back, they're loaded. Receiver, they've got tons of talent. Offensive line, we've seen this group play together. We know that on a good day, they can lead the offense to 200 yards rushing and 450 plus yards of offense and 40 points against a Power 5 team. Okay. Defensive line, linebacker, corner, same thing. Safety to me is the one that's still the biggest question mark, because you have Xavier Watts, who's a star. And then after that, it's a lot of question marks. Can Rod Hurd transition from nickel to safety? That's still a question mark. Can a guy like Don Schuler take the great spring he's had and vault it into a successful fall? I don't know. We'll see about that one. I think I love what I've seen from him, but there's still things to prove. So, and then after that, it's major question marks. Your next two guys that aren't freshmen are guys that have had major injuries already at Notre Dame, and Luke Talich and Ben Minnick, who've had to miss multiple games because of injuries. So I would say, Irish Gordy, not Mike, I would phrase it differently, because if you're going to say what will the weakest position group be on the team, then I'm going to have to go, and Vince is going to love this, it's punter, because that's the only position group that I think is a concern for me right now. If I'm going to look at offense and defense, it's not that could be weak. Offense, defense, there's nowhere where they're weak. There's areas where I'm concerned, and I'm still concerned about the safety room after Xavier Watts. Is that a fair way of putting it? Because I use the word weak, and it's going to make it seem like, wow, it's weak. I don't think it's weak. I think Notre Dame's I had Notre Dame ranked 6th in my preseason top 10. You're not going to be 6th if you have weak spots like that. There's areas where you're not as strong, but I don't know if it's an area that you're weak. Because if you're weak, then I probably won't have you in my top 10. If you have a major weak spot at any of your skill positions, lines, whatever the case may be. But safety still is the biggest question mark. But here's the counter to that. If the Don Schuler can build on what he did this spring, and if Rod Hurd can play, if he can simply play safety at the same level he played nickel at Northwestern, then Notre Dame will be better at safety next year than they were in 2023. I don't even know that that's debatable, to be completely honest with you. I don't know that that's debatable. We have another Al Washington question from my guy, John A1. How confident are you in Coach Washington's ability to develop players? Howard Cross, Riley Mills, and Javonte Jean-Baptiste were all developed to a playable rotation level by other coaches. After they depart, are they confident in the 25 D line will be on par or above the physical talent in the room? Couple things on this. I want to push back on this a little bit. You're spot on about Javonte Jean-Baptiste from the standpoint of he spent a lot of his career being coached by someone else. But I don't think we can ignore that the Javonte Jean-Baptiste that we saw in 2023 was the same guy at Ohio State. He just got more opportunities. I don't think that's fair. I think there are things that Al Washington did to bring the best out of him. And I like what I said earlier is Al Washington has not shown that he can, and this was before your question. I said this after your question had already been put out, and John, so I know that you're not responding to what I said. But the comment that I said was Al Washington has not shown that he can recruit. He can take kids from recruit to college to develop into an impact line. He hasn't shown that he can do that. He didn't recruit Josh Burnham. He didn't recruit Jordan Patel. He didn't recruit those guys. But you also can't ignore the fact that Howard Cross was a lightly used player before Al Washington showed up. Yes, Howard Cross spent multiple years with Mike Elston. And yes, I absolutely think that Mike Elston played a key role in Howard Cross's development because I think Mike Elston was a good football coach. But I also don't think that you can say, to the degree that you said it, that he was developed to a playable rotation level by other coaches because, you know, like Riley Mills, for example, Riley Mills was coached as a defensive end for a lot of the time that Mike Elston was here. And when you look at a guy like Howard Cross, for example, I mean, you know, this is a kid I'm looking up the snap counts now from PFF, but he didn't play the kind of minutes he did. So I kind of get the point you're making, but I just want to push back on the notion that these guys were necessarily developed by other guys. I think when you look back on the careers of Howard Cross and Riley Leonard, or Riley Mills, you're gonna have to say, look, Mike Elston and Al Washington both played very important roles in developing those guys. So, but to your point, which is more of what your point is, and I think this is where I agree with you, is what we don't know is could he have taken Howard Cross and Riley Mills and Javonte Jean-Baptiste in their freshman forms and developed them into what they became in their veteran forms? I think that's a much more fair question. And that's something that I'm more sympathetic to. And I honestly don't know that we have the answer to that. You know, we've talked about this before. You know, in 2016, Al Washington did a very good job with the Boston College defensive line. Very good job. You know, you talk about he had Harold Landry, who was a junior, had 22 tackles for loss. Kevin Kovalik that year had 14 and a half tackles for loss. He had Zach Allen on that team who had 10 tackles for loss. But the thing is Harold Landry was in his third or fourth year at college. Kevin Kovalik, I believe, was in his fifth year of college. And Zach Allen was in his second or third year of college. That was his first year coaching the D-line. He had been at BC for several years before that. But in the years before that, he was the running backs coach. And so it was a different animal. He was a assistant. You know, I think he coached D-line maybe in 2012 before those guys showed up. So even then, he's never been anywhere long enough to really develop guys from start to finish. And the only place he was at even close to that was Ohio State, and people didn't like the job he did. So I think it's a very fair question to say, can he, once these veterans leave that have been developed partially by him and partially by others, can he take guys from start to finish and turn them into big-time players? I don't know that I have a lot of confidence in that, John. And it's not lack of confidence from the standpoint of I don't think he's capable of it. It's more so I don't have any evidence that he can do it. I don't have evidence that he can't do it. I don't know. And unknowns are always concerning things for me, especially when it comes to position coaches. And so, because there's so much that goes into it. And so Like Marcus Freeman was a bit of an unknown in that regard as a head coach, clearly, but he was absolutely a known commodity in being able to develop players from a positional and a defensive standpoint, because he did took a bunch of Cincinnati players at young ages, and they over the course of years became a big time defense. And so I think those are legitimate questions. And somebody just asked a question, and I'll answer it. So Al Washington's first full-time job, he had a job for 2 years at Slippery Rock, which is a D2 school. Then he spent 1 year at Elon, and then he spent 5 years at Boston College, his alma mater. He was an assistant special teams and D-line coach in 1 year. Spent the next 3 years coaching running backs, and then the next year was the D-line coach again. Spent 1 year at Cincinnati as the D-line coach, spent 1 year at Michigan as the D-line coach, then spent 3 years at Ohio State. So he has not been anywhere where he has had freshmen that he then took to be seniors anywhere. So I can't really tell you that he can do it, but nobody else can tell you that he can either, because it's an unknown. We haven't seen it. So I honestly don't know, because, and here's why some people say, well, look, the job he did with those veterans last year shows you. No, he can't. Because Charlie Weiss showed at Notre Dame that he can take a bunch of veterans that somebody else kind of coached to a certain level from a fundamental standpoint, and he could take them to that next level, right? Charlie Weiss showed that. But what Charlie Weiss also showed is that when he has to take a team and he has to instill fundamentals and discipline and structure and all those type of things, he can't build that same type of team. And that's how a team that Charlie Weiss had in 2009, which had loads of talent, went 6-6, because they weren't taught the basics that his first 2 years at Notre Dame had been established by someone else. So like the receivers, his first 2 years were solid fundamental players. Trent Miles, who's now on the Notre Dame staff again as an analyst, did a solid job. He did a real solid job teaching the basics of the Notre Dame wide receivers, Raymond McKnight and Jeff Samardzija. The problem was their scheme was bad and lacked innovation. And there was issues with Ty Willingham and his leadership and things like that. But like, they taught the basics relatively well. They weren't coordinated all that great. The head coach had some leadership issues, but they taught the basics. And then Charlie comes in with the basics established, and it's about the scheme. And they were lights out for 2 years. But the minute all those players are gone and they had to start over with such a young team, you were in a situation where he was exposed for what his limitations were. That's the fact. When it comes to Al Washington, the reality is we don't know that he can take young players and develop into veterans. All his success, his entire career, as far as I can see, coaching D-line, has taken players that somebody had been coaching for a few years and then taken them to the next level. And he deserves a lot of credit for that, because that's not always something that people can do. It's an unknown if he can do that with a guy like Josh Burnham, who he's the only guy that's ever coached. Or if he can do that with a Boubacar Traore or other players. That's an unknown. But there are at least enough flashes, in my opinion, where you can say we have seen some growth from Josh Burnham. We have seen some growth from Donovan Heinisch. We have seen some growth to a degree this spring from Boubacar Traore, who are guys who've only been coached by Al Washington. So I would say that I've seen some flashes of it, but now we got to see those guys take those jumps. If Josh Burnham and Boubacar Traore have impact seasons to some degree this year, and Donovan Heinisch becomes a real key member of the rotation, then my optimism to this answer being yes grows significantly, because those are guys that have only ever been coached by Al Washington. That's going to be the big key is if you want to know the answer, watch those guys. Watch them. Don't watch Bryce Young because he's a 5-star talent. Watch Burnham and Traore and Heinisch, and whether or not he can get guys like Devin Houston and guys like that ready to go. That'll be the key for me to tell us what the answer to this question actually is. Good. It's a good question, and it's a good debate, John, because I think that's a fair question to ask about Al Washington. And that's a fair question to ask about a lot of coaches at different times. It's like, I mean, to me, it was a fair question to ask of, like Mike Mickens, for an example, when he first got here. We know he can recruit and develop players at that level, but can he do it at the Notre Dame level? I think that was a fair question to ask when he first got here. Well, now we know the answer. He can. Can Chris O'Leary recruit at a high enough level at a place like Notre Dame? Well, we know he can coach, but can he recruit? No, that was a fair question. When he got hired, can this guy coach? This guy's coached at Florida Tech and Indiana State. Can he coach elite talent and get those guys to buy into what he's coaching? That was a major question mark when he got hired. Well, then he showed he can do it. And so that's always something that you have to look at and say, hey, can this guy do this at this level? Can he do this with consistency? Can he do this when there's not a track record of showing that? In Al Washington's case, the track record is not from a showing that he can't do it, but it's not being in a position where he has shown he can do it. And so I think that's of all the things that we criticize him for, that's one of the more fair things, in my opinion, to bring up as far as a big picture thing. You can say, I don't like how he handled the Justin Scott situation, and he did a very poor job there. But then people would get mad about that and ignore the Cole Mullins pickup, the Logan Thomas pickup, and all these other pickups. And I'm ticked about the Marco Jones thing, but I'm not going to allow that to make me pretend like he didn't have a big role in getting Chris Burgess. That's more of my issues with a lot of this conversation at this point. John A1, this is a fun one. I saw this before the thing, and I'm going to do my best to answer it. John A1 asks, which team without a first-round pick will trade up into the first round, and should they trade up? So you have Carolina, Cleveland, and Houston. I'll say this right now. Carolina absolutely should not trade up, because trading up equals giving up more draft capital. The Carolina Panthers are not even close to being a team that if they trade up and hit a home run with whatever pick they make, they're all of a sudden going to be a contender. They have lots of holes, so they should not be sacrificing draft capital to move up into this draft class. Cleveland Browns and Houston Texans, to me, are more in a situation where they could be willing to do that. And just because they're both, I mean, the Texans especially have had a very good offseason. And they're a team that you look at them and you say, hey, man, like they're trying to make some moves. They're trying to be a team that's getting somewhere. And so when you look at Cleveland, for example, the Browns' first pick it's 54, right? That's their first pick. I mean, for them to get into round one from 54 to 32 or higher, they're going to have to give up a lot. So it would have to be for the right guy. Would I be willing to do that if I was the Browns? I'd at least be willing to consider it, because you're a team that's got a pretty good roster, especially if you get your Deshaun Watson back. You're a team that's got a pretty decent roster. You hit the right spot. Maybe your team can maybe take a jump and make a run next year with some free agent signings. The Texans also are another team that in my opinion should consider that, and they're in a little bit better position than the Browns. Their first pick is 12 spots higher. They also have pick 59 and 86, so they have a little bit more draft cap, like high level draft capital to work with than the Browns do. So they're another team that I would consider it. But honestly, I don't know. Like to really get a guy that's going to be a needle mover, you're probably going to have to jump into the top 20. If somebody falls really bad at 25, maybe there. But you see a lot of these teams, instead of jumping from 42 to 27, they may see how the board shakes out in round one, and then that's when you see a lot of movement at the top of round two, because you don't have to give up as much. You have to give up something, obviously, but you don't have to give as much to jump up to 33, 34, 35 and get a kid that you like that as you do is jumping all the way up to 21 or 22 or 15. So I don't know that any of them will jump in around one. I think Cleveland and Houston could make an argument for it if the right guy's there. It'd have to be really the right guy. Carolina should have no business doing that, in my opinion. They have way too many needs. So I would, if anything, I mean, Carolina's, what's their first pick? It's like 33, right? Doesn't Carolina pick hold on. So let me look this up. Where's Carolina? Yeah, their first pick is 33. So Like Carolina's literally at the end of the first round. They also have pick number 39. If they wanted to jump into round one, they could do so. They have the capital to do so in that regard. But here's the thing: if they trade up, let's say they trade picks 33 and 39 to move up to 22 to get somebody. Well, or 15. Okay, so now you've got pick 15, and then you're not picking again until 65, end of the second round. Where right now you've got a chance at 33 and 39 to get two pretty good football players. Now, maybe if you could say, hey, we can give up 33 and 65 to jump up 3 or 4 spots, maybe. But now you've plugged two holes at, let's say, 27 and 39, but then you don't pick again till 101. And that's getting into round 4. So again, they have a lot of different needs, and they're in a pretty good spot at 33 and 39 to come out of this draft with two pretty good football players. Like at 33 and 39, in my opinion, I believe there's a chance that there's going to be a pretty good wide receiver there in one of those two spots to draft, and potentially a decent tackle prospect in one of those two spots. Where if you have to give up both of those to move up to get one, then maybe you're not so good. But even if they traded up, let's say they gave up 33 and 65 to move up to 23, and then some later round picks. Just for hypothetical, I don't know how the math would work on that. Okay, so they get a pick at 22, and let's say it's a really good receiver or a really good offensive tackle, and then they stay at 39 and they get a really good receiver. Okay, cool. They don't pick again till 101. And now they don't have any draft capital to move a lot more up in those areas. And so now you've addressed two holes, but you needed a lot more. Where if you're picking 33, 39, and 65, I think is what did I say? You're now talking about basically 3 picks in the first 2 rounds. Your chances of getting, hitting maybe 3 spots are increased than if your third pick is 101. And so Carolina's a ways away. If you want to move up a couple spots, like let's say they go from 33 to 31 because they want to leapfrog number 32, I could see that. And then they won't have to give up quite as much. But if I'm them, honestly, if I'm Carolina, you know what I would honestly do? Because you have that 39th pick, I would be willing to trade one of those two down to pick up more, depending on how the board shakes out. Like get the guy you really want at 33, and then maybe at 39, field some calls and maybe pick up some extra draft picks because they have a lot of holes. They have a lot of holes they have to fill. There's no question about that. That's my best shot at an NFL draft question. So Ryan probably thinks I'm nuts, but hey, that's where I'm at with it. And I like having some fun with those things. Father David says over under 8.5 players transfer out from Notre Dame during this transfer window. If we're talking scholarship players, I would definitely take the under on that one. I would take the under. John A1 with a question. Which Notre Dame offensive tackle has the most potential for 2024 opposite Charles Jagasaw? Most potential? I'd probably go with Gerby Lambert. Even as a freshman, potential, I'd still say his potential in 2024 is higher than anybody else's in 2024. If I was going to say the next guy, it'd probably be Sullivan Absher next. And then Tosh, and then Emil Wagner. I just haven't seen it with Emil yet. I haven't. I hope that I'm wrong on that one. I want to watch him in the spring game, but I just haven't seen it with him yet. I really haven't. My wonderful wife made me a hot tea before she left. Got to try to save the pipes a little bit. Ballpeen Shalala with a question. A fun doomsday scenario. All punters transfer out, and Notre Dame is to hold punting tryouts with the team. Excluding kickers, what players would you bet on to win the job if you had to place bets? Well, number one, if I'm Notre Dame, and I'm saying this for the benefit of someone who's on the back end of the show right now, I would probably make a phone call to the D'Addario family and see if I could get their son to reclassify and move up to the 2024 class. So Vince will probably love that one. But no, Ryan and I were actually talking about this before the show. Josh Burnham was a punter in high school. Josh Burnham's just a great athlete. I'd give him a chance. I think Bronte Johnson punted a little bit, and Anthony Rizek's a guy that I think athletically could do a lot of things. So I'd give Anthony Rizak a chance to maybe try out for that as well. But Josh Burnham, I believe, is the one guy that I know punted in high school. And I feel like there's another player that punted, and I just can't remember who it was. And I'm trying to remember who it was, but I just don't remember who it was. But I feel like there's another position player that was a good punter in high school, and I, for the life of me, can't remember who it was. But I do believe Josh Burnham was a pretty good punter coming out of high school as well. So real quick question here, real quick. So Joe Marciano says, how many practices have been completed? By my count, today was 13, which leaves them one short of 15. They've had 14 practices. The scrimmage is 15. When they say 15 practices, you always have the spring game counts as one. But yeah, they've had 14, Joe. They've had 14. All right. Let's get to some more here. Got a couple that I think we can kind of knock out kind of quickly and get caught up with some of these. John A1 with one says, did Coach Reese or Kelly, given some of the backstory, it would be Kelly, get it right in 2021 going with Angeli instead of pursuing Aller, Winslet, or Klubnik? Well, Gavin Wimsett, they had to drop because of academics. So that was not a decision. They liked him a lot. They would have taken him, but he didn't have the academics. They tried to go for Drew Aller. See, here's the thing. There's some premises that we need to correct. They went for Drew Aller before they went for Steve Angeli. The problem is they waited too long on Drew Aller because they were still trying to get in with Wimsett, Ty Simpson, and some other guys like that. And so they waited too long to get in on Drew Aller. By the time they got in and pushed for him, Penn State had already kind of solidified that. They didn't make a push for Steve Angeli until they knew or had a good, strong feeling that Drew Aller was going to pick Penn State. So they did not pick Steve Angeli over Drew Aller. That's just false. Now, if I were to grant your premise and say that they did pick Steve Angeli over Cade Klubnik because they did not like Cade Klubnik coming out of high school. I think that was a mistake, but so far, Cade has not been the player that I thought he would be. But I'd still take him over Steve Angeli because he's a lot more proven and he can move around a lot more. And I would also take Drew Aller more. And I had somebody say this to me one time, and it's just kind of, there's just not a lot of logic that you can apply here to convince me that Notre Dame would be better off with Steve Angeli over Drew Aller. And I know the arguments that people make. I've heard them make them. Well, if you look at what Steve Angeli did in his first start, he did better than what Drew Aller did, who had some issues last year. Number one, I think the opinion that people have of Drew Aller is completely faulty. Drew Aller was not a great quarterback last year. He had some ugly games last year, but this is also a kid who was basically in his first year as a starter that threw 25 touchdowns and 2 interceptions last season. You know, Steve Angeli did a nice job in the bowl game. He went 15 of 19 for 232 yards and 3 touchdowns in his first start against Oregon State, an 8-win team. Drew Aller's first career start came against West Virginia, a team that ended up winning 9 games, and he went 21 of 29 for 325 yards and 3 touchdowns against a better team and in a different situation. You know, so let's not act like he hasn't had some pretty darn good moments in his career as well. He's had some rough ones also. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is youth. Some of it is he's got a bit of a long delivery, which at times can get him in a little bit of trouble. I think he needs to process information better, but that's absolutely a complaint that I would make of Steve Angeli as well. Drew Aller is a much bigger arm. He's bigger than Steve. Steve's more mobile than Drew Aller is. But Drew Aller, to me, is still absolutely a better prospect than Steve Angeli is. And all you're basing your opinion of Steve Angeli on is a start he made in a bowl game against a depleted defense as a second-year player and what he did in mop-up duty. And in my opinion, Steve Angeli, as a sophomore, threw for 504 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 1 picks against not a single first-team entire defense. Drew Aller last year in a league with some pretty good defense. He played against Iowa, who had a top 10 defense last year. He played against Ohio State, who had a top 10 defense last year. He played against Michigan, who had a top 10 defense last year. Played up against much better defenses. Passed for 2,600 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Is he a work in progress? Absolutely. Does his game need a lot of work? Absolutely. But what I think happened last year with Drew Aller is the expectations were way too high. People put way too much on his shoulders, It's one of the reasons that I didn't think Penn State should have been ranked as high as they were, and he learned a lot of lessons. Now you give him a much better offensive coordinator, a more experienced team around him, and I think he'll be better. Is he going to light the world on fire? Probably not. I don't think he's that kind of talent right now. But is he a guy that I would rather have over Steve Angeli? With all due respect, yes, I'm sorry, I would. He's just a better talent than Steve, and is far more proven and established than Steve. And so again, if you want to take Steve Angeli's one game and compare it to Drew Aller's, then the only thing you can do in fairness is to compare their first starts. And in their first starts, Drew Aller had a more impressive performance. That's all you can do. We haven't seen the body of work from Steve. We haven't seen teams like some people say, well, this whole we've seen film of a guy is BS. No, it's not. When you see film of a guy, you know his strengths and you know his weaknesses. You know where he doesn't like to throw the ball and you know where he likes to throw the ball. So you can better defend to take away the areas where he likes to throw the football. And so as he plays more, then guess what? Then he's going to have some weaknesses. And so, but he was terrible against those defenses. He was terrible against those defenses. Detro Hunter, I'm not arguing he wasn't. But what I'm saying is he's a developing quarterback. He did not play well in those games with a bad offensive coordinator and not a lot of help around him. He didn't play well. But what evidence do you have that Steve Angeli would have played better? This isn't a would you rather have Drew Aller or Quinn Ewers conversation. This is a conversation of would you rather have Drew Aller or Notre Dame's backup quarterback? That's the point. If you took Steve Angeli and put him on Penn State's team last year, what confidence did you have that he would have played better against Ohio State, Penn State, and Iowa than he did? And again, you're talking about two defenses that finished last year in the top 5 nationally, and actually 3 defenses. Last year, Ohio State finished number 1 in fewest yards allowed. Michigan finished number 2. Iowa finished number 5. He played against all those teams last year. You want to look at QB rating, pass efficiency, defense. Ohio State finished number 2. Michigan finished number 3. Iowa finished number 4. You know who else didn't play very well against him last year? Michael Penix. He's a Heisman finalist. He didn't play very well against Michigan's defense last year either. You know who did play well against Michigan's defense last year throwing the football? Do you know of a team that last year that lit Michigan's pass defense up? I don't know of one. I mean, honestly, you could argue that Kyle McCord probably had the best game against Michigan's defense all last year, and he still threw 2 picks. He was the only guy that was at 9.0 yards attempt or better. I mean, no one played well against Michigan's defense last year. Drew Aller was rough. That was one of the worst game plans I've ever seen. And again, this isn't about Drew Aller, right? I mean, you can think whatever you want to think about Drew Aller. This is a question is, did they get it right not taking him and go for Steve Angeli? I don't know what argument you can make to say that would have been the right decision. There isn't one. You don't have one. And so I just think that would be a bad way to take it. If you want to have a conversation about how good of a player Drew Aller can be, we can have that. We can have that conversation. And in some areas I'll agree with you, in some areas I won't. But that's not the conversation here. The conversation here is he a better prospect right now than Steve Angeli? And I don't even think that's debatable, to be completely honest with you. The only argument I could make for Steve Angeli is he wanted to be at Notre Dame and Drew Aller didn't. And that matters to me. But if we're talking about who would I rather have as a starting quarterback, that's an absolute no-brainer. John A1 asks, how important is it for Jabron Payne to have a strong finish to the spring, given the talent of the freshman backs? I don't think it matters, John. I really don't. I don't think that they need to say anything special from Jabron. They know who Jabron is. They know what he can do. There's nothing he could have shown in the practices that they're going to look at in the spring game and say, hey, you have to do this, you're going to get passed up. Now, on the flip side, if Jabron goes out and has a good game, I don't think that hurts him at all. I think it helps him, certainly, to which is kind of a part of your question, John. I think Jabron running behind that O-line and, let's say he carries the ball 13 times for like 85 yards and has a really good day. I think it helps Jabron and solidifies his standing. I don't think him not having a big day hurts him. That's the only thing that I would say. Because If he has a big game and Keidron Young or Aeneas Williams are still better than him in this fall, in those 20+ practices in the fall, he's still going to get beat out. If he doesn't do a whole lot in the game and go out and in the 25 practices leading into the Texas A&M game, he's still better than those guys, then he'll play. It's as simple as that. I don't see any decisions being made based on how he plays in the spring game. I rarely, especially for a guy that played as much as he played last year. Ided Banami asks, is James Simon a three-back class realistic? James Simon in a three-back class realistic? I know the visit really got Notre Dame on the map for him. Is it realistic in that Notre Dame would do it? Sure, it's realistic. Do I think that all of a sudden Notre Dame is now a major player for James Simon? Talk to me if he schedules and makes an official visit. Talk to me after the Texas visit this weekend. I think Notre Dame did a really good job this week of making themselves more of a player. I still don't think they're going to get him as of right now with what I know right now, especially with this visit coming up for Texas, who a lot of people perceive to be the leader. So if he gets out of this weekend and this next week and doesn't commit to Texas and he schedules official visits and Notre Dame is one of those officials he sets up, then I'll start to believe it. Do I think he can be part of a three-man class? Yeah, because I think that you'll still see Daniel Anderson and Justin Thurman stay in the class. I don't think they'll choose to jump out of the class. Justin Thurman's a guy that can do a lot of different things. So, yes, you'd have three backs, but you're in a situation where you can do some different things with Justin early in his career as you kind of sort things out. So it's realistic. It's, in my opinion, not likely. I don't know how likely it would be that if they added James Thurman or James Simon, that both of the running backs in the class would want to stay in the class. I think that could happen as well. So for the fact that I still don't think they're the team to beat for James Simon, the fact that I don't think that all three of those guys would stay in the class if he signed, I would say I very much bet against it. But is it realistic? Meaning that there's a chance it can happen? Sure, it's realistic. I just don't think the odds are great on that one. Got a question from Skylar Indy. It says, it seems that for some teams, that spring game has turned to a circus event. Are teams required by the NCAA to have an open spring game? I don't believe they're required to do it. No, I don't. I'd have to look into that, Skylar, but I don't know that they're required to do that. But I don't know why they wouldn't do that. I mean, look, it's a good event. It gets, because here's the thing, you could say it's turned into a circus event. Well, I would ask what you mean by that. But I would say that there's two ways of looking at it. One is, it's not taken real seriously. Teams do different things. They don't tackle. If you're talking about like that, then sure. But they're still getting that big scrimmage in. They just get it in usually sooner, the week of the game. Most teams do that. And so, look, I think it's kind of a fun way for the players to end the spring. They go play a game. They have some fun. It's not super, super, super serious. It's you kind of go into the spring or the off season with some fun momentum, and you've kind of established some things. I mean, there's a case to be made for that. I kind of still like the idea of having a spring game be competitive. I do. If it was up to me, I would still do that. I would still have that situation. I think a lot of it comes down to coaches don't want to show things on film because now every spring game is televised in some capacity. I think that's overthinking it, but I'm thinking that it's overthinking it now as I'm not a coach anymore because I'm on this side of it. But if I was a coach and I had stayed in coaching my whole life, I'd probably feel the same way that they do. I don't want to put a lot out there on film. I want to have this scrimmage where we can kind of let it all out and call of all of our plays and not have to worry about it being on film. I'm sympathetic to that. I still would like to see the scrimmage kind of be more open. Maybe you hold a couple plays back and stuff like that, but I still would like to be more competitive, but I'm okay with the way that it is. I think the things that get kind of ridiculous are the teams that just don't tackle, like Ohio State's. That's just ridiculous. You're getting nothing out of that, in my opinion. So I don't particularly like that. And then the other parts around it, the pomp and circumstance, that's actually a good thing because that's as close as you're going to get this spring to a game day environment. I mean, the players are going to do the Basilico, the player walk, most likely. I would imagine that they'll do all that. You're going to have fans in the stands. There's going to be tailgating. There's going to be tons of events on campus. So I think in that regard, there's lessons to be learned for Notre Dame specifically. So I don't think it's a circus event. I'd be curious what you mean by that. And I think it's fine. It's fun. It's fun. I mean, at some point in time, we need to be willing to be okay with these kids having fun too. I mean, that's the that's kind of the reality of it. So yeah, again, I don't know if there's rules that you have to do something. I don't. I've never even thought to look into it because it's just been a known. So we'll see. Andrew Burke says, blue gold inspired question. Who wins? Who's win? Who would win? The 2012 defense versus the 2015 offense. That's a good one. The 2023 defense versus the 2005 offense. The 2002 defense versus the 2019 offense. Okay, these are good ones. I'm going to take the one that I believe is the most no-brainer, and I'm going to go with the 2002 defense would beat the 2019 offense. I think the defense in 2022 would give them some problems on the defensive line. I think up the middle, Cedric Hilliard, Darrell Campbell would be pretty good players. Up the middle, I think you had some decent players on the edge for Notre Dame that year. You had a really good linebacking core, and you had a pretty good secondary that year. And you'd have been able to schematically with Glenn Earl, whether it's Vontaze Duff or Shane Walton, and then Glenn Earl and Jerome Sapp, that four could have, I think, done enough damage to not let Claypool or Cole Kmet go off. So then you could say you're going to have to beat us with somebody else. And I don't think that Notre Dame had other guys could beat them. So I think that defense would win the matchup up against the 2019 offense. Your other two aren't as obvious to me. I'm going to go on the first one with the 2015 offense. And to me, it's about matchups. And the 2015 team would have just been too fast for the 2012 defense. Love Kavari Russell. Great player as a freshman. Like Bennett Jackson a lot. But I watched Will Fuller and Chris Brown give Kavari Russell problems in practice when they were seniors. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what would they have done against or juniors and seniors? What would they have done when he was a freshman? Because, again, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about 2015 version of Chris Brown and Will Fuller against 2012 version of Kavari Russell and Bennett Jackson. I like that matchup for the 2015 team. I think yes, the defensive line for the 2012 team was excellent. Excellent. But that 2015 offensive line was elite. Because here's the thing, guys. I've said this a million times, and I believe it. If Notre Dame would have had a legit defensive coordinator, I think that 2015 team could have competed for a title. Well, in this scenario, the 2015 defense is irrelevant. We're talking about this side of the ball. I think the best unit that Notre Dame had in the last 15 years was those two units. That was the best offense they had. That was the best defense they had. I just think in the matchup of those two teams, the speed of the 2015 offense would have given the 2012 defense a lot of problems. And they were good enough up front to at least neutralize the 2012 defensive line. That would have been it. The 23 defense against the 2005 offense would be a really interesting one. And I'm not sure how I feel about that one, to be completely honest with you. I'd probably lean towards the 05 offense, and I would pick the 05 offense because I just think Brady Quinn that year was just on a different level than he was in 06. I think the receiving core would have given, like, they had the size to give this, as good as Notre Dame's corners were this year, they would have had the size outside to make some plays. And then you have Anthony Fasano at tight end. You have Darius Walker out of the backfield. And to me, one of the weaknesses of this defense was you could hurt their linebackers in the pass game. There just weren't a lot of teams that could kind of take advantage of that, to be completely honest with you. And I think the 25 team could have. The offensive line wasn't great, but it was good. It was good. I think that team would have moved the ball against them. You'd have been able to hit some big plays down the field. They were great on that back shoulder stuff. And so I'd go with the 05 offense. I would. I think you could make a case for the 23 defense. I'm curious what you all think. I'm curious who you guys think would win that matchup. That's the one that I probably think is most debatable for me. but I would lean towards the '05 offense. Somebody just said Darius Walker would not have done anything. Come on, man. All right, I'm breaking my own rule. All right, my new rule for the show, responding to that. But come on. All right, let's get back to back to the questions. We've got some more down here. Let's get to PA Irish Guy. For all the probs at wide receiver last year, they were great blockers. How have they looked from what you have seen this spring on that front? I honestly, I couldn't tell you. They haven't run the ball a ton in live settings. We saw a little bit of running in the scrimmage last week, but there were some RPOs mixed in. I didn't really honestly pay attention a lot to the blocking. So I don't have an answer for that. I think last year's receiving core was good at blocking. I don't think they were great at it. They were good. They had some really good moments, certainly, but they also had some inconsistent moments. They were pretty good. I don't want to take away from them, but I think great is a little bit strong. I think it's a little bit strong, to be completely honest with you. I do. Jason DeWilkins says, as much as I love my guy Justin Fisher with him and what seems to be the forgotten man Jabron Payne in the backfield of the gold team, do you see that still being the way that do you still see that? Do you see that still being that way come tomorrow? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't know why they wouldn't. I mean, could they have somebody play both ways? Sure. I don't know why you would. I mean, the blue team has Jeremiah Love and Danius Williams. That's their only scholarship running backs. The gold team has Jabron Payne and Justin Fisher. I mean, you're not going to have two of your top 5 running backs in the scrimmage tomorrow. You're not going to have Keydron Young, and you're not going to have Jarian Price. So I would imagine it'll stay that way unless somebody gets banged up. And, I mean, I could see like Dylan Devison playing both ways. I could see him putting a green jersey on and playing for both teams. I don't think you'll see Jeremiah Love or Aeneas Williams do it. I wouldn't be against Aeneas doing it, to be honest with you. I wouldn't be against Aeneas getting a lot of burn tomorrow and playing for both teams. Like maybe the first half he's with the blue team, maybe in third quarter, and then by fourth quarter you change it. Let him play with the gold team in the fourth quarter, perhaps. I'd be okay with that. I'd be absolutely okay with that. Ronnie Reeves, Bryan, you told me to bring this question back up in the next mailbag. Thank you for doing that, Ronnie. If Deland, Mike Mickens, and Golden all took head coaching jobs elsewhere, who would be your wish list candidates to replace them? Running back, I'd say Tony Alford's always going to be my go-to there. Al Golden. See, here's the thing. Al Golden, that's a good question. I'd be willing to bet you a decent chunk of change that Marcus Freeman would look to the NFL for that hire. And yeah, kind of like what he did with Al Golden. He wants a complex defense. He wants a defense that's, I would say complex. That's the wrong word. He wants a multiple defense. He wants a defense that does a lot more substitutions and situational football and things like that because of the unique type of schedule that Notre Dame plays. You get so many different types of offenses nowadays, where in the 80s you'd play a lot of different teams from different conferences, but you'd play the triple option with with Navy, and then the wishbone with the Air Force, and then Miami kind of had their throw it around, but then everybody else kind of did similar things. I mean, in regard to, there weren't like these dramatic differences like I think we see now. And so I would imagine he would want someone from the NFL. Who that would be, I don't have a specific person for you. I really don't. And so I think that's what he would do. As far as replacing Mike Mickens, man, that's I got to look this one up because I have a couple ideas on who I would like, but man, I don't know that I really have a great answer for that one, to be honest with you, Ronnie. I mean, can I cheat a little bit? Well, no, because he coaches safeties. I was going to say I could cheat and say Phil Parker is my D coordinator and DB coach, but he would be more with the safeties, not the corners. Man, that's a good one. I mean, Corey Raymond's a guy with a strong reputation. Steve Klingscale is a guy that did a really good job at Michigan that people are very high on. Fran Brown was considered a top DB coach, but he just left to become a head coach, so he's not an option. Dante Williams is a guy that gets a lot of love, but I think he's more of a recruiter than a coach. I'm not super high on him, to be completely honest with you. Honestly, I'd have to kind of go through it and really think about it. I don't have a great answer for you on those right now. I don't even know. I mean, look, Jeff Burris is a DB coach. So my fandom part of me would want to say that, but I don't know. Like, I don't know what kind of Coach Burris is right now, and so that would make it a little bit challenging, to really have that answer. So, Joe Allen, over under 2.5. How many sacks tomorrow? Over under 2.5 sacks tomorrow. Taking the over for both teams. Take combined over. Definitely taking the over. Jason Smith asks, "What are your thoughts about Marshall Faulk's comments about running backs?" Well, yeah, this is the good one. I wish that. This is a good one. I'd be very curious to get Ryan's answer. He's not obviously doing the show with me today. But Jason Smith says, "What are your thoughts about Marshall Faulk's comments about running backs willing to split carries? Is why the running back position has been devalued so much. Essentially, their fault for not demanding." Let me see if I can find the rest of Jason's question here. I didn't star both parts of the question. Give me 1 second, Jason. Got to scroll all the way back up to the top because we're still pretty early in the questions. There we go. To be the bell cow. That's how he finished it. I look, who am I to argue with a Hall of Fame running back? And I think what he said absolutely has some merit, but I don't think it's that simple. I think there's a lot of things that factor into this. Number one, the game has changed. You just don't have offenses that run a lot of those need a bell cow running backs like you did in the past. And when you're in a situation where even let's take the Los Angeles Rams for a second, right? Love that Kyren Williams had the season that he had last year, but the Rams are a team that are always going to value throwing the football. And yes, they need to run it. A lot of teams need to run it. But let's say Kyren over the next couple years goes out and emerges as one of the 2 or 3 best running backs in football. If you're the Rams, are you really going to want to invest a max running back contract in Kyren Williams? I wouldn't. I don't know that there's a ton of value in doing that, right? Because the game just isn't driven the way that it used to be. And so even though the Rams ran the ball as well as almost anybody last year, I think they were, Kyren Williams finished like 3rd or 4th in rushing last year. They're still a team that's going to say they're going to put a lot of value on the throwing game. Most teams do. And so outside of like the Niners and the Titans with Derrick Henry, are there a lot of teams that are going to say, hey, we need to go find our Barry Sanders. We need to go find our Emmitt Smith. We need to go find our this or that. No, I don't think there's a lot of teams willing to pay max dollar for that, because back in the day, that's what won. A lot of teams, you ran the football. That's just the way the game was played back in the day. It's not the way the game is played anymore. You value those running backs that can catch and throw and all those type of things. There's just so much more to it. And then the other part of it too is it's just simple economics. Like, listen, it's always a little cyclical, right? I mean, there's just certain positions that you're just not going to pay top dollar for. In the past, a long time ago, you didn't pay that kind of money for offensive linemen. You just weren't going to give that kind of money for offensive linemen. There were other positions you weren't going to give a lot of money for. There was a time in the NFL when D tackles were getting huge deals, and there's been times when they weren't getting huge deals, and now they're kind of back to getting big deals again. There was a time when linebackers would get big time money. Now linebackers don't get as much money. Why? Because they're not on the field as much. I think that's really what it comes down to for a running back is, just the way the game is played, running backs aren't asked to carry the load the way they were before. So if I have to allocate resources, I'm going to allocate resources to more of the guys that are on the field on offense all the time. Receivers are going to play more than running backs. They're not going to touch the ball as much, that they're going to play more. More often than not, quarterbacks are always on the field. Left tackles are always on the field. Offensive linemen are always on the field. I need pass rushers. I got to put money into my pass rushers. I need cover guys. I got to put money into my secondary. And now I've got to pay 3 cover guys on the second level instead of 2. When back in the day it was corner, strong safety, free safety, Sam, Mike, Will, and that's kind of what you lined up with. And then you'd have the occasional nickel package. I mean, nowadays I've seen studies where teams spend 60+% of the time in their their different packages. And so you just have to be able to look at the positions, and they're not valued certain ways for a lot of different reasons. And so I think that factors into it as well. And I think with a lot of systems, a lot of coaches believe that our system is going to generate yards. And so I don't really care if I've got this elite guy or that elite guy. I'm not going to pay this amount of money because I can go, meaning Mike Shanahan did this to a degree. I'm not going to pay this guy a lot of money when I can just go draft somebody in the 4th round next year and pay him for 4 years on his rookie contract and get the most out of him and then do it all over again. So I think there's just a lot of different factors. But do I think that running backs not wanting to be the bell cow is part of it? Sure. And why did they initially kind of not do that? Because they didn't want to get the tread on their tires, because of the way that the NFL valued running backs is you'll pay a receiver into his 30s. You'll play a quarterback till he's nearly 40. Running back, the closer a running back gets to 30, and this has been true for a long time, the closer a running back gets to 30, the less likely you are to pay him. Why? Because of the usage. So the thought is, well, if I don't get used as much, then I can play longer. It's not how it works. So I think those things are, it's a lot of things. And so that's my best guess, and my best, not guess, it's not a guess. That's my best analysis of it. Is I just think there's always more than one reason for it. I'm not dismissing what Marshall Faulk said. There's a lot of merit to it. And I mean, talk about a guy that the usage was enormous. I mean, Marshall Faulk not only was the bell cow as a running back, but he'd catch almost 100 balls a year as well. So when he talks about guys need to be willing to step up and take more of a burden of it, sure, absolutely. That I think that's part of it, but I just never. Things are rarely that simplistic. There's always something more to it, and again, including base. Listen, with as crazy as quarterback numbers are nowadays, I mean, Daniel frickin' Jones got a $50 million contract last year. It's insane. It's nuts. You can't pay everyone. You can't pay Daniel Jones that and pay Saquon Barkley. It's just math. You have a salary cap. It's just math. You can't do it. So what's the one position where you can kind of sacrifice a little bit? It's running back, because it's easier for me to find a guy. It's easier for me. Not everyone's going to agree with this. I get that. It's easier for me to find someone to do what Kyron Williams did last year than it is for me to find someone that can do what Cooper Kupp can do, and then do it every 3 or 4 years, in my opinion. It just is. And so I think that's a big reason why you're just seeing it. It's another key reason why it's being devalued, in my opinion. Boy, lots more questions here. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. I don't know that I'm going to be able to get to all of the questions today, because I'll be honest with you guys, I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit, and that's never, ever fun. All right, let me get to one here from different aisle. Thoughts on the NCAA just approving helmet communication, the 2-minute warning, and sideline tablets for 2024. What's the 2-minute warning one? I didn't see that one. Helmet communication, I'm fine with that. I don't think it's going to be it's not an easy thing to do. It's as people think. There's cutoffs to it. There's things you got to make sure that you're getting your communication in a lot of different ways, because let's be honest, you're not huddling a ton. And so when you're not huddling, you've got to get your communication in some way, somehow. And so you still got to worry about signals and things along those lines. So it's not quite as simple as people are making it out to be. And so I don't know that it, so I'm reading it now. It says the NCAA panel also approved automatic timeouts with 2 minutes left in the second and fourth quarters, akin to the NFL's 2-minute warning. The timeouts will not be additional television timeouts. All timing rules will be synchronized, including 10-second runoffs and stopping the clock. Yeah, right. Let's see how often they don't do a commercial break. Look, guys, that's really what it comes down to. It's they want shorter games, but they're not willing to have less commercials. So I think Yeah, I don't feel like going on a rant today, to be completely honest with you. So we'll talk about that one another time. But that's nothing more than getting more quarterback. That's just nothing more than getting more TV timeouts. And they can say it's not, but we all know it is. Mark Avalone, you've mentioned in the past concern over private quarterback coaches. Are any of the Notre Dame quarterbacks using one? I would imagine they all are. And again, I don't have a problem with private quarterback coaches in theory. I have a problem with the fact that there's a lot of not very good ones. Like there's a guy, what's his name? I think it's like Balin Trio that trains Brady Hart and Noah Grubbs. I don't know a thing about this guy, but I know several of his prospects and they all are pretty good players. So he must be doing something right. You know what I mean? So like there's proof is in the pudding. I'm all for getting private coaching if you can afford it or if someone's willing to do it. The issue, however, is that number one, you've got to be careful that you're not getting someone that's undermining what you're being taught or what you need to do at the place you're playing for now. And then number two is you got to make sure you actually get a good one. And there's a lot of bad ones. And the issue it comes down to, if you're not a proven established guy, you've got to kind of come up with a reason why people should work for you. So you've got to kind of create problems where they aren't. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of the movie. There was a movie I watched. It was from the 80s, I believe. Where a guy pulls into a thing and he's like, trying to figure out what's wrong with his car. And the guy just keeps breaking things to fix in his car. And yeah, it's like, well, if there's nothing wrong with it, no, actually he says, it was one where he says, there's another one where he's like, if there's not something wrong with it now, there will be. Basically saying like, you're going to pay me one way or the other. And that's kind of what it boils down to is like, if a kid's really good, what's my angle to try to convince him that he needs me to work him out? Well, I gotta invent a problem or create a problem where one doesn't really exist. I think the best quarterback coaches are the ones that take a kid's natural ability, make corrections where they're truly needed, and then make enhancements, and then teach the kid to do things that are somewhat repeatable. And I think those are what the good coaches do. Trying to get Brady Hart and Noah Grubbs to throw the exact same way, the exact same techniques, not going to work. There are certain principles that you're going to teach no matter who they are or what their throwing motion is. Absolutely. So it's more about just with anything. It's an oversaturation of the market that is more of the issue than the idea of period of quarterback coaches. If there's a guy that's got a proven track record of developing quarterbacks, and you want to have your son or nephew or yourself go train with him, he's got a proven track record, go for it. I just think avoid the celebrity QB coaches and make sure that it's someone that's has some sense and it's not just saying, hey, we got to reinvent the wheel with your kid. That's probably not someone you're gonna want to deal with. ICURN with Irish Luck. Curious, when Kelly came to Notre Dame, I remember him supposedly being an offensive guru, I thought, but looking back at his coaching before the head coach, he was always on defense. Was Jeff Quinn that good? So no, that's not accurate. Brian Kelly came up as a defensive coach. So he was the defensive coordinator at Grand Valley State before he was the head coach. But Brian Kelly eventually took over the offense. And I've seen this before with other guys, but he eventually took over the offense. He was the play caller for those 01, 02, and 03 Grand Valley teams. He was the play caller at Central Michigan, and he was the play caller at Cincinnati. So he was an offensive guy. When he came to Notre Dame, a couple things happened. Number one, he tried to initially implement his system with players that didn't really fit it that well. And then instead of just recruiting to fit players that made it, he just kind of changed it. And I still say this, the Alabama game spooked him big time. And I don't think he ever recovered from that. And then he was always trying to play catch up with other people instead of being an innovator, which he was early in his career. He was very innovative early in his career, very much so. He just wasn't that guy at Notre Dame. And honestly, I don't think he worked that hard in Notre Dame. And you can be really, really smart and win at other places, but you can't just be really, really smart and win at Notre Dame. You got to work. You got to recruit. You got to do all the things necessary. And I think Brian Kelly fell in love with the fame of being the head coach of Notre Dame, and he wasn't the same guy that he was before. I think he loved being in the lab. I don't think he ever liked recruiting. I don't think he's ever been a guy that was like super passionate about developing young people. I think it's always been about Brian Kelly. But I think Brian Kelly loved the game. I think he loved being smarter than everybody else. I think which is fine. That's not a criticism, by the way. I'm a big fan of that too. I think he loved being innovative and all, but then you get to a point in time where it's like, I don't really care about being that guy anymore. And I think that's what he was at Notre Dame. Or he thought he was that guy, but didn't have to work at it the way that he used to have to work at it. I think that's the difference, because his success at Grand Valley came out of failure. They were struggling and they had to do something different. And he did that, and he had a lot of success. And he didn't stay on that innovative track when he got to Notre Dame. And that's my view of why it happened that way. Good question. Ronnie Reeves, how much will Dre Brown's departure hurt recruiting? Look, it's going to hurt, and from the standpoint of Dre did some really nice things in Notre Dame. Dre was never the primary, right? And that's where I don't think it'll hurt, because right now Chad Bowden's staff is not as strong as it was when Dre Brown was here. Dre was really good. I've heard a lot of really good things about Dre. I'm super happy for Dre. I hope he does a great job at Illinois doing what he's doing. But it's an easier position to replace than had they lost Chad Bowden, because Chad was so much more involved in running things. It was his vision. Dre was carrying out Chad's vision, and Chad's carrying out Marcus's vision, right? And so you're losing a great soldier. Chad's kind of, he's a general, and then Marcus Freeman's the supreme allied commander, you know what I mean? And so, Chad's General Patton and Marcus Freeman's Dwight Eisenhower, right? Well, Dre is just he's a lieutenant, right? He's a soldier. And the vision is still being set by somebody else. Now, he was good at that, but it's a much easier replaceable job, because, again, he wasn't the primary with guys. He was a great resource. He was a great tool. He did great at what he was, but it's like, okay, we can find someone to develop to be good at that as well, just like they developed Dre. So they'll be able to transition from it really well, but I want to make sure that I'm not saying that in a way that diminishes what Dre Brown did at Notre Dame, the role he had developed into, and how good he was at it. It's just the nature of where he was not going to be as difficult to replace as it would have been if they'd have lost, like, Chad Bowden, for example, to Michigan. But look, you always want talented people around. And from everyone that I've talked to before, because here's how you know someone really respects a guy. There's selfish reasons. If I'm running something, there's selfish reasons for me to say publicly, hey, this guy does a great job. You're going to want to, we love what he does. He does a great job. There's selfish reasons for me to say that. But then when a guy leaves, when you talk to sources, you can then kind of say, okay, yeah, we tried our best with him, but the reality is he wasn't doing that great of a job anyway. Whatever. The thing I liked is when I've reached out to people since Dre's left, it's the message. Loved him. Great guy. Did a great job. He's got a bright future ahead of him. And he's going to do great at Illinois. We're going to miss him. The message has been the same. It's did a great job. So it's not like, well, Dre really didn't do that much and he wasn't really that involved. It's nothing like that. He did a great job and we're going to miss him. But Marcus Freeman and Chad Bowden found and developed Dre. The thought process is they're going to be able to find and develop the guy to replace him, or guys to replace him, whatever the case may be, or ladies to replace him, and the way recruiting is going nowadays. So that's kind of where it's at. I think they'll be fine, but I also don't want to disrespect the job that Dre did, because I think Dre did a really nice job, and he was coming along. If he would have stayed a couple more years, I'll say this: if Dre would have stayed 2 more years, it would have been a lot harder to replace him, because they were on the verge of giving him more primary work. But because they hadn't done that yet, I think it's going to be a little easier to replace him. John Long says, is there any chance Riley Leonard came back quickly to practice because he felt pressure to not let the young guys Wally pip him? No, I don't think that had anything to do with it. Look, Riley Leonard could have wanted to come back to practice all he wants, but if he wasn't cleared, he wasn't going to practice. And if he really wanted to come back to practice to not get Wally pipped, then he would have tried to do more team stuff. Riley Leonard's not worried about getting beat out. Riley Leonard's worried about learning the offense, developing within the offense, getting on the same page with the receivers, and getting healthy. Because if he does that, then he's going to be starting quarterback, and he should be starting quarterback. It's not about, oh, gee, I might get beat out. It's I might get beat out if I'm not healthy. And so, if anything, the incentive is to not come back sooner. So, John, I understand where you're coming from. I do. I just don't think that's applicable in this particular situation because he is a different type of quarterback than those other guys. He's a much, much more proven player. For him to get beat out, those other guys would have to be significantly better than him. And I just don't think that's possible. Tavis McKay asked this question, and I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but I'll do it more directly. He says, what are your thoughts on in-helmet communication being improved for college football? One player who is indicated with a green sticker on the helmet. Well, I don't care about the green sticker, but yeah, it's one guy can have it. I'm a fan of it. I don't think I think if you have the technology to make the game better, then use it to a degree, as long as it's not manipulating the game. And so being able to communicate calls to your players is something I'm totally fine with, as long as there's a cutoff point. Like, I don't want it to be where, your quarterback is dropping back, is about to snap the ball with 2 seconds left, and your coach is telling him where to throw. If you can game the system a little bit to where you're snapping before the communication is cut off, fine. But even then, once the ball snapped, the communication is cut off. You wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want there to be communication to to the entire time. It's just constantly talking. I mean, there's got to be limitations to where you're allowing technology, but being able to communicate calls to your players. I mean, to me, it's like this. What is me verbalizing a call to a guy any different than me having to do signals, other than just making it an easier process? And so I have no problem with it. I like it. I think it's good for the game. It's good for communication. But at the same time, you can't be lazy with it, because there's still going to be signaling that has to be done, in my opinion, because unless you want to huddle all the time. So if you're a team that likes to push the tempo a little bit, if you have a veteran quarterback, you can do that. But what if you have like would you really want Trevor Lawrence being responsible for, as a true freshman in 2018, of getting the call and having to let all 10 other guys know really quickly because we're going to motion, we're going with some tempo, getting the call correctly to everyone? No, I want him worried about his read and his job. I'll get the signalers, let those guys know. So there's still going to be some level of communication that's going to have to happen with younger players. Would Sam Hartman in 2022 at Wake Forest need that? No, he wouldn't, because he's been in a system for 5 years. He could ask more of him. But early in your career, when you've got a younger quarterback, let's say Ohio State starts Julian Sayin this year. Let's just hypothetically, or let's say the CJ Carr starting in Notre Dame for whatever reason, or Kenny Minchie starting in Notre Dame for whatever reason, injury, beat out, whatever. You're really going to ask them to get the call from you and then make sure all 10 guys you've got the signals, you've got the calls, you've got all of that to them if I'm going tempo? No, I want to be able to line up and get the signals in, and then he can make whatever checks he needs to make. I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. Now, there's things that you could do. You could have guys a little bit closer. If you're going tempo, they can be right, hey, look, here's what you do in tempo. You just go line up. Well, now maybe your tempo is not quite as tempo-y, so you have him a little bit closer. You get the call. He says it real quick. Boom, you guys go line up, and you get the call. I mean, you could do some of that stuff. But if you're going to really be a tempo team, then you need signals. You need people signaling into different aspects. You can get the signal and line up and go. You're going to lose a little bit of that if you're just going with verbal communication from the quarterback. You're going to lose a little bit of that. For Notre Dame in past years, you don't lose any of it as far, because you're getting the signal in. Now here's where Notre Dame would have had problems in the past, is they would break the huddle at the time when the thing was cut off because they weren't moving fast enough. So you're going to have to make sure that you're going to move a little bit faster pre-snap to get the call in and get the communication in, and then have some communication to the coach or the quarterback if you want to have more of that. Same thing with the defense on that side of the ball. And then I think where it really helps, and I'm curious what you guys all think about this. I actually think it helps defensive teams more than offensive teams, because you can get defensive calls tend to be a little less wordy. And you can kind of, as offensive teams are moving around, you can kind of be telling the Mike linebacker. Like, for example, when Notre Dame's playing teams that are kind of moving with some tempo or even just lining up, you're going to be able to get the call to Drake Bowen. He can then make the calls. It's a lot easier to make those calls, in my opinion, defensively, because they kind of all go a little bit more together. And they're, like I said, they're less wordy. But you can then get checks into him a little bit later than you can a quarterback, because a defensive check is a little bit simpler than an offensive check, especially when you got a guy like Xavier Watts behind it, because he's making the secondary checks. Drake's mainly making the front checks once the initial call has been made. And it's a lot easier to say, hey, do this, do this, do this, and then quickly get the 3 technique moved inside or get the call made when you see what a team's doing. So I actually think it could help Notre Dame's defense even more than it'll help their quarterbacks this year in this particular situation. Felix Fournier, how many receivers will be taken in the 25 class? 4 is the ideal number. I could see a scenario where they take 5. We've talked about this before. If Javon Boggs wants to come today, would they take him? I believe they would. Would they still recruit Derek Meadows? I believe they would. So I do think they would take both of those. Archer 452, what is your take on the Super League for college football? 8, 10-team divisions, generally broken up by geography. Notre Dame being in the Northeast with BC, Maryland, PSU, Pitt, Rutgers, Syracuse, whatever. I'd be against that because, number one, I don't want Notre Dame Archer, you had to know the answer to this question. When you're going to ask me about Notre Dame being in a league, that I'm going to say I don't like it. I don't like that Notre Dame would be in a league in this scenario. What you're describing, however, what annoys me about this, not what you're saying. I'm good with your question, but what annoys me about people talking about this nationally is they're acting like they're onto something. Basically, what you just described is called this: the Big East, the ACC, the SEC, the Big Ten, the Big 12, the Southwest Conference, the Pac-12, and the Mountain West. That's what you just described. 8 conferences, around 10 teams each, mostly broken up by geography. So if you're going to do that, just go back to the freaking way it was before. That's my take. So what's my take on it? It'd be dumb because, as a Notre Dame fan, I don't want them in a league. And I don't know what being in a league with Boston College, Maryland, Penn State, Pitt, Rutgers, Syracuse, Virginia Tech, and West Virginia does absolutely nothing for Notre Dame. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So if you're going to do this because, let's say it's because you've now got some sort of rev share in college football. Well, if there's a rev share in college football and you have 80 teams that are considered power conferences, right? So 8 leagues, 10 teams, 80 teams. Well, then what you can do is go back to the old regional systems, and if people want to be independent, let them be independent. Notre Dame wants to be independent, let them be independent. If Penn State wants to go back to being an independent because now there's a rev share from a TV standpoint, then let them be independent. If Florida State wants to go back to being an independent because they don't want to be in the ACC and now there's a rev share and everybody's getting the same TV money, then let them be an independent. Let Miami go back to being independent if they want to. And then the ACC can be an 8-team conference, and the Big 8 can go back to being an 8-team conference, and the Southwest Conference can be, what were they, 8 or 10? The Pac-8 wants to go back to being the Pac-8 or whatever the case may be, and then you've got the Mountain West teams in the Mountain West. If there was that kind of rev share, then cool, let's do it. But let's go back to the way it used to be and let teams be independent if they want. Let's get back the regional rivalries, because to me, there's a lot of teams in there that Notre Dame fans don't give 2 rips about playing. Matter of fact, I would argue outside of maybe Penn State, I don't know that there's anybody in that Notre Dame fans really give a rip about playing with any consistency. So, let Notre Dame be an independent team and play whoever the heck they want. Go back to the Big Ten being, here's a crazy thought, 10 teams, and go about it that way. So that's what I would do, is I'd go back to the way it was and then just have if you truly want to fix the game, to where you get rid of this haves and have-nots, where just some teams just have no chance of competing for championships right now. Like I've said this Sean Davis and I were talking about this. There's no way we'll ever see in college football, in any way that I can think of it, UConn against Purdue in a major championship on the line game in football ever, because the way that the game is, the money in it, it's just not going to happen. And that to a degree, I'm okay with that. You're always going to have some level of the haves and have-nots, but if you want to expand the haves, then the best way to do that is to create a setting where there is a rev share amongst whoever you view as the power conferences or the power teams. Is say, hey, look, there's all these three networks. We're gonna pool ESPN, CBS, whoever together. They can pay for however much they want. We'll make that deal. But then here's how it's being split up. We're going to do a rev share that goes in twofold. We're going to take a percentage of the rev share. Let's say it's 10% of whatever this new contract is, and it's going to go to all the players in the league. Everybody gets a minimum of $10,000 from the rev share, right? Something like that. And then you can do your NIL stuff on top of that. But this is what we can do. Take 10% of it, and it could be 20,000. I don't know how much it would be. Take 10% of our new deal, and if you're a scholarship player in good standing academically, you get this much. If you're not in a good standing academically, you get less. I would do that, incentivize it. And then everybody else gets X amount of dollars from your TV contracts. However, if you're not living up to a certain standard academically, you make less money. And that's how I would do it. But you have a standard across. So now if you want to do better and you're in the SEC and you want to win, you actually don't have to work to get more money. You have to do it the old fashioned way. We have a booster system, a donor system. You have to do all that and make it work that way. I think that would be better. And then that would allow us to go back to having regional conferences. We wouldn't need the Big Ten feeling the need to go out and get, USC and LA and that market, and get, Seattle and Oregon markets, and the SEC feeling the need to go get the Dallas market, because the Dallas market doesn't matter. This is your rev share. Right. And so I think that would be the best way to make it work. And then now it's about how well do you run your school? How well do you run your institution? How well do you run your football program? I think those would all be things that I would say would make for a much, much better situation for the game of football. That's kind of where I look at it. So, and somebody's asked, how about a standard of spending? Some of these so-called Power 5 programs don't spend any money. They just cash checks. So that's their right. They have a right. If you're okay sucking, you have a right to do that. Okay. Because what will happen is if the donors at a school don't like that you don't do things to compete, then they won't give you their money. But if the donors are okay with it and they're still going to still give the money because it is an academic institution and we care about this, that, or the other thing, then go for it. I mean, that's fine. I'm about choice, and to a degree, right? Like, so we're going to give you this amount of money. What you do with it is up to you. I'm going to do the best I can in this setting to make sure that things that are outside of people's control, we kind of, we kind of fix this. Because, like, here's the thing. The Cincinnati Reds in Major League Baseball cannot control, no matter what they do, the fact that their TV market can never, ever, ever compete with the New York TV market. There's nothing they can do about that. There's nothing. They can't change anything. They can't go win this. They can't go win that. There's nothing they can do about it. So not having some level of a salary cap, so to speak, is always going to make teams like the Pirates and the Reds at a disadvantage. We're talking about a little bit of a different situation because that's more salary related, but it's related to your market. And the small market teams are always going to suffer. And it's the same thing here. The teams that right now are in big TV markets, or like in the South, where the whole South is a big TV market, because it's what the South loves, is college football. That's fine. But the reality is that they're always going to have an unfair advantage over a program somewhere else that may have every desire and plan to win, but because they don't have the money just pouring into the program, they're always kind of doing it with the hand tied behind their back about TV money. And that's not about how well you run your institution or how well you run your program or what you're committed to. It's just, here's where it is. This is who you are. And so to me, a salary cap, so to speak, not salaries for players, it's a bad example, an evenly distributed revenue share amongst all power teams, right? Whether it's 60 or 70 or 80, whatever the case may be, is what it should be. Now, what you do with that money is up to you. Because here's the thing you have to understand, Andrew. You can say, well, these people are just going to cash checks. All right, then maybe you can come up with some like relegation system where if you don't spend this or this or this, or if you don't have this whatever level of commitment, then we'll drop you down and we'll bring up Boise State who's willing to spend. I don't know. You could maybe do something like that. That's not something I've put a lot of thought in. But here's the thing: if I'm giving $50 million out to everybody, that's the number I'm going with, and this team spends it wisely, and this team doesn't. How's that any different? Like, here's the thing: if you give me $50 million and I take 30 million of that and I invest it smartly and I go get this and I do that and my team's better than yours, and then you spend $50 million and to go raise another 20 and spend $70 million, but you spend it poorly, I'm still going to be better than you, right? Because I've spent my money wisely. This isn't a contest of who can spend the most money. It shouldn't be anyway. It is, but it shouldn't be. So if a team, and the other thing is I can not spend a lot of money and still suck because I'm just a cheap, what? Okay, but that's my choice. That's the choice I made as an institution. Say, hey, we're going to invest this money towards this or that or the other thing. I would say there needs to be an absolute open books, right? If you're going to get this money, we have a right to know exactly how you're spending the money from a department standpoint. We spend it on this, we spend it on training, we spend it on this, we spend it on gear, we spend it on whatever the case may be, coaching, salaries, whatever. If you're going to invest that money into the institution as a school, then go for it. But the fact is if you're going to get that money, you should be allowed to spend it however you want or how much of it you want. And that'll be the right. If they choose to do that, they can do that. That's the fact. That's the reality of it. And you continue to show this colossal misunderstanding of how this all works, and I'm not going to be able to convince you of it. But the fact of the matter is that there's no perfect system. You think there's this perfect system out there, not Archer. I'm talking to Andrew. You think there's this perfect system out there that if you just do this, this, or this, everything is going to be rosy. That's just not reality. It's ridiculous. And the reality is you could say it's ridiculous that Clemson and Florida State have to share with the rest of the ACC. And I'm going to say to you, you don't understand economics because there are programs in the ACC that are more valuable than Clemson and Florida State. You keep thinking this is about the football product. That's not what drives revenue. It's not the only thing that drives revenue. There's a reason that the Big Ten would rather have North Carolina and Virginia than Florida State and Clemson. Why? Because those institutions are more valuable. There's a reason the Big Ten preferred USC and UCLA over Washington and Oregon, despite the fact very clearly Oregon and Washington are better football programs than UCLA and USC. Why? Because it's not about the market. Why did the Big Ten want Maryland and Rutgers? They suck. But why did they bring value to the league? They brought value because they are in markets that add value. So they should be rewarded for that. So you're going to say we're going to bring them in because we value their market, but then we're not going to pay them because they suck? That's not how this works. This isn't about rewarding who's good on the football field. This is all about TV revenue. And there are teams that are really good at football that don't generate a lot of TV revenue. That's the reality of it. And so you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how this works. And you have a fundamental misunderstanding of how being in a league helps you. You could take Florida State and Clemson out of the ACC, put them in another league, and guess what? There's going to be teams that suck in those leagues too. And they say, well, okay, we'll get rid of all the teams that suck and only go with these 40. Well, guess what? Some of those 40 will then start to suck. That's reality. That's the on-field product. But none of this has anything to do when we're talking dollars and cents with the on-field product. If it did, why does the SEC not want Florida State? Do you think it's only about, well, Florida doesn't want them? No, they bring no financial value to your league whatsoever that you don't already have because it's not about football. There are teams in the ACC that both the Big Ten and SEC would much rather have than Florida State. You think it's because they're afraid of Florida State on the field? No, because it's about markets. North Carolina is in a much better market than Tallahassee, Florida. It's a fact. So that's how this thing works. And so until you understand that, you're going to continue to have issues with how it happens. And there's things that we can discuss about, should this team be in it? Should that be team in it? That's fine. But that's fantasy land stuff. In the real world, that's just not what's driving all this. I'm not saying I like it. I'm not saying I'm happy about it. I'm not saying I enjoy the fact that teams that don't do anything athletically are getting rewarded because they happen to be in big markets. I don't like that. I'm a big fan of rewarding people for merit. I think if you are consistently putting the best product on the field, I'm a big fan of that being rewarded. But there's no system that's going to be able to do that and have any sort of equality, in my opinion. And so to me, that's where I'm at. Is I'm an equality guy, not an equity guy. I'm about opportunity. And I think when you have things like Major League Baseball, it's impossible to have equality because there's just certain things that are just always going to be unfair towards this group to that group. So there's things that I think the NFL has done a good job of this. If the NFL didn't have a relatively even distribution of TV money, then you'd have certain markets like the Jets and the Giants would always have advantages over, think of Kansas City. I'd have to actually look what Kansas City's market is. I don't know. I could be wrong on that. Minnesota, right? There's just going to be things that don't work. So now, okay, we're going to even this part out. Now it's about how well you run your organization, how well you draft, how well you hire, how well you fire, how well you do all these kind of things. In college football, there's just certain institutions that'll never be able to compete with this program over here, not because they don't have good recruiting areas. It's because they'll never have the money that those teams have. Like, let me ask you this. If they created a system where all of a sudden, TV-wise, San Diego State was making the same amount of money and having the same amount of revenue as Penn State, you don't think that San Diego State wouldn't have an opportunity to now to jump to another level of success because they can now hire the best coaches, they could upgrade their facilities, they could get better recruits, and all of a sudden they'd have an opportunity to go be competitive. There's plenty of players on that part of the country. And there's a lot of kids that would say, I'll go to San Diego to play football. The money's not there. The program's not the same. The facilities are not the same, and you're just not going to go there. And so that's why I say, and this isn't about merit. This isn't about the quality of our how we run our institution or the quality of our coaching. There are some coaches, no matter how good a coaches they are, they're just never going to be able. Kansas is never going to be able to win the way that Alabama does in football, not consistently, for a million reasons. And I don't care who you hire as your coach, just that way. In football, basketball is a little bit different. But in football, that's the way that it is, and it's always going to be that way to a degree. So TV money in a lot of ways has been good for the sport, but in a lot of ways has also been very bad for the sport because of the fact that they haven't created a system that has any sort of balance to it. And because of the fact that they cut the players out of it for so long, that they've now allowed things to get to the point where it's just destroyed the game. And so, as always, once greed becomes the driving force in your decision-making, you're most likely going to ruin whatever it is you have. A lot of marriages that are successful when one side is especially greedy at the expense of the opposite? I don't. Do you know a lot of business relationships that work out well when one side values about greed for their betterment at the expense of another? I don't. And we're seeing that in college football as well. I guess I kind of went on a rant a little bit, didn't I? But it wasn't an angry rant, just kind of how it is. Joseph Barnett, Bryan, did Tennessee's AD contact Niall Ivey about the women's basketball head coaching position? Her name was floated around by some Tennessee sports media people. I have no idea if they contact or not, Joseph. Honestly, I wasn't really cued into that, nor did I care. But I'll tell you this right now. There's no way Niall Ivey was leaving Notre Dame for Tennessee. No way. Notre Dame is doing a lot for Coach Ivey in the program and building that up. She's an alum. I mean, she's getting recruiting, and she'll at mean, you could say, okay, she'll never be Muffet McGraw at Notre Dame, but I don't agree with that. I think Coach Muffet McGraw was a legend. Coach McGraw was a legend. Her statue was deserved. I mean, she won 2 national championships. She won tons and tons of games. I mean, she deserves everything. But if Niall Ivy goes out and matches her success, wins a couple titles, I think Coach Ivy can surpass her perception-wise with the fan base, because Niall Ivy has something that Coach McGraw didn't have, which is the love that Notre Dame fans have had for Niall Ivy goes all the way back to when she was a player and won a championship as a player. She was also part of Coach McGraw's championships at Notre Dame as an assistant. So Coach Ivy would have the unique aspect of, not only did I win my own national championships as a head coach, but I also was part of what Coach McGraw did. So she would have a very unique standing at Notre Dame. And this isn't something like she would ever use that like in to say, I'm better than Coach McGraw. It's about the perception of her by the fan base. I don't know that there's anything Niall Ivy could do at Tennessee outside of a Gino Auriemma UConn run, which isn't happening, to ever be on the same sphere as Pat Summitt. I don't think that'll ever happen. So I just don't know that there'd be a lot of value going there, in my opinion. Now, did they reach out to her? I don't know. I mean, maybe, but there's no way that was going to happen. And as I've said before, whenever you hear media people talking about names being floated, it's usually a lot of times it's BS. JU asks, what's the prediction for the QB roster next year? I have no prediction beyond these are the guys that are on scholarship. It's Riley Leonard, Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchie, and CJ Carr. I'm not going to get into the predicting who will or won't be here, who may or may not leave, and those type of things. If guys choose to leave, then I will stay on it. But when they don't, if they don't, then I'm it is what it is. I'm going to evaluate what we know. What we know is these are the 4 quarterbacks. When that changes, I'll evaluate it as such. Ronnie Reeves asks, I heard Jason Garrett say several times that Hartman was the best deep ball thrower in the country. Was that just hyperbolic or any truth to that? Well, of course it's hyperbolic, because anytime you definitively say this guy is the best in the country at this, there's some level of hyperbole to that. Where I think there's some truth to it is Sam Hartman threw a really pretty deep ball when he threw a deep ball. I don't think Sam Hartman did enough reading the deep ball well and throwing it well, but when he read it and threw it, he threw it pretty good. Is he the best in the country? No. Is he top 5? Maybe. But in that instance, it was a very hyperbolic in my view. But that doesn't mean he wasn't good at it. So there's some truth to it as far as him being a good deep ball thrower. But no, saying he's the best in the country is incredibly hyperbolic. Irish Gordy Knott says, my biggest question, how does Emil Wagner weigh 300 pounds but still look so dang skinny? He doesn't weigh 300 pounds. And part of it is because of what I've said before. A lot of the weight he's gaining is in upper body, shoulders, chest, things like that. He's always going to be narrow hipped. He's always going to have a narrow behind. He's never going to be a guy that looks super thick. That's just the reality of it. So he's always going to look somewhat skinny unless he gets fat. And I mean like unhealthy fat, like it's just, he's always going to be that way, but he's not 300 pounds. I don't care what they say. He's not 300 pounds. All right. Back up says, any info on how they found the Rice DB? The pick I saw, he was sporting double shoulder braces. I have no idea what you're talking about. So I have no idea what you're talking about. I should have pulled that up. I'm sorry. I don't understand the question. Andy Milton fan says, what game or games scares you next season? I don't get scared by games. Notre Dame should not be scared of any opponent. If I were to say which teams do I think have the best chance to beat Notre Dame next season if Notre Dame doesn't bring it, Texas A&M. I'm just going to go in order of the schedule. Texas A&M, Louisville. I'm trying to remember when Georgia Tech and Florida State fall on the schedule. I believe Georgia Tech is before Florida State, but let me just look that up here real quick. So I'm going to go Texas A&M is a team that can absolutely beat Notre Dame if they don't bring it. Louisville can beat Notre Dame if they don't bring it. Georgia Tech at Mercedes-Benz is a team that could beat Notre Dame if they don't bring it. Florida State and then USC. Those are the 5 where I would say those are games that you could struggle with. The 2 teams that I would say most concern me today would be A&M, simply because it's the first game of the year, and first games are always kind of, can always be a little tricky. And then the next one would probably be Florida State, because I think that's the next most talented roster they play. And you always kind of have that respect for the team that has the most talent. And that's where I would go with that one. It's a good question. WJS, love the board at IB. Thank you for that. Do you eventually think you guys will make it an app? No, I mean, look, you can make a link for it on your phone and click on it, and it'll take you to the board. But the odds of it being an app, sure. I mean, could it happen someday? Sure. But everything I have found, that's a $40,000 to $50,000 investment at least. And that's on top of what I have to pay, the thousands of dollars I pay every year to even have the site running as it is. So the bigger sites can have an app because they have a corporation that's basically backing them, and they're all kind of together. I'm an independent site. The board is an independent site. I run it. I own it. Every expense that it has comes from out of my pocket. So as much as I would love to have an app, we're just not at the size right now. Now, if we grew and we doubled our size of our message board, and we were still having great success with this website and the podcast and YouTube channel, would I invest the money in that? Absolutely, I would. I'm not against it. I just can't afford it. I don't have the revenue to do that, nor do I have the time to really do what I would need to do to make sure it worked and worked effectively. So do I think we'll eventually have one? Depends on how much we grow. I mean, I'll put it like this. We have 16,000 subscribers on YouTube. We're over 3,000 on the message board. That means there's 13,000 people that will consume our content for free, but don't financially support us. And I don't know that there's many people that I see give super chats consistently that aren't also on the board. The vast majority of people that give super chats are also on the board. If half of the people that are subscribed to this channel, the YouTube channel, would join the message board, I would absolutely have the revenue to do something like that. But the reality is that's just not where we're at, nor will we'll ever be there. I mean, when I left BGI, we were a little over 4,000 subscribers, and it was dwindling every day because people are just far too many people are just want content for free. They want it to be good, but they don't want to pay for it. And that can then limit some of the things you do unless you're with a corporation backing you. And I'm just not going to do that. So would I love to have an app? I'd love to have an app. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it. Do I think it will happen? I hope so. But I have my doubts just because of the cost for it and a lot of other factors that make it very challenging for someone like me to do that. Have a couple super chats. Got one from Hawk, and I appreciate you saying you love the message board. I really do. It means a lot, and I appreciate your support. Hawk Strong goes to the super chat, says, replace Ian Book with Jimmy Clausen. Would he have more wins, and would he be more competitive versus Clemson? Would he have more wins than Ian Book? Oh boy, I would say yes, but not by a ton. Because, I mean, Ian's problem wasn't that he couldn't win. I mean, look, does Notre Dame go 12-0 in 2018 with Jimmy Clausen? Yeah. Do they go better than 10-2 in 2019? Probably. I think they probably beat Georgia with Jimmy. I don't think they beat Michigan because that was a much bigger issue. In 2020, they went 10-0 again. Lost to Bama, Clemson. So basically what you're asking here is essentially, because Ian Book lost, 5 games as a starter? The question is, would they have won one of those? I don't think they win without, even with Jimmy Clausen. I don't think they beat Michigan. They lost by 31 points. That team didn't want to be there that day. Do I think they would have beat Clemson in the ACC title game in 2020 with Jimmy Clausen? I do. Do I think they would have beat Clemson in the playoff in 2018 with Jimmy Clausen? Maybe. What I can guarantee is it would have been a much more competitive game. Would they have won? That's a different question because that Clemson team was pretty good, and they would have game planned differently. If they feared Notre Dame's offense more, they might have done some things differently as well. Once they went up 17-13, they knew they weren't going to lose that game. And so they didn't do a whole lot of things to really put themselves at risk like we saw early when the D-line was really harassing them. So maybe would they have been able to beat 2020 Georgia or Alabama with Jimmy Clausen? Probably not. But again, it would have been a much more competitive game. I just don't think they had the perimeter skill on either side of the ball to beat that Bama team in 2020, even with Jimmy Clausen. Would they have been able to beat Clemson in 2020 in the ACC title game? I believe so. Would they have definitely done it? Would have been a close game. But I would say if the ranking the games that I think they would have won with Jimmy as certainty to least certain so it's like one game in 2018, 2 in 2019, 2 in 2020. Am I correct? Those are the 5 losses from Ian. The game they definitely, I think, would have won with Jimmy Clausen. They definitely would have beat Georgia at Georgia. No doubt in my mind, they would have beat Georgia at Georgia. Then the ACC title game would be next. Clemson 2018 would be next. Michigan 2019 would be next, just because, again, there were so many things about that game that would have had – there's nothing Jimmy could have done. And then Alabama 2020 would be next. Those would probably be the 5 I would rank them. But I think they would at least have won one of those games, if not 2 of those games. But then you have to ask yourself, if they had Jimmy Clausen and they went 11-0 going into the playoff, they probably don't play Bama in the first round. They would have played – I'd have to go back and look, but they would have knocked Clemson out. Bama and Ohio State would have been 2-3, or maybe they'd have played Ohio State. I think they'd have had a shot to score on that Ohio State team. Could they have stopped Ohio State that year? Maybe not. But they wouldn't have played Bama in the first round. That's the one thing I know for sure. Either Notre Dame or Bama would have been the 1 seed that year, and Notre Dame wouldn't have been the 4 like they were. So that might have changed things a little bit. Another super chat from Andy Milton fan says, which Notre Dame players were the biggest enigmas to you? Coaches, watching BK's face get red makes you feel. I don't get the last part. Which player's the biggest enigmas to me? Oh, Chase Claypool. It's a huge enigma to me. He was a hard kid to figure out. You just never knew what you're going to get from him. Miles Boykin's another one. Notice a pattern there. An enigma to me is guys that just had all the talent in the world but just could never put it all together. Derek Allen still, to me, to this day, is a bit of an enigma. I just don't know how much he loved football. I'm trying to think of some other guys. I mean, those are the ones. Just Julian Okwara. I mean, he could have been so good if he wanted. If he had his brother's work ethic, he could have been so good. So of the last 10 years or so, those would probably be the biggest ones for me. Coaches, I don't know that there's been a lot of enigmas. I think most of the coaches are what they are. And it's just who they are. So that would be mine on that one. And then let me get down here to a few more, because I do got to get here. My voice is about to go. So let me just see if I can find a couple more. Let's see. I did talk about the quarterbacks going live, the 2-minute rule. 99 Problems BK1 says, I agree with you on the Angeli conversation. My issue, though, is that you are minimizing Steve in the bowl game, but previously touted the O-line performance in the same bowl game. Yes, and I've explained exactly why, and I'll be very clear as to what the difference is. Here's the difference. The defensive line for Oregon State was the same defensive line they had all year. They were missing a backup defensive tackle. Everybody else that played in that game on the defensive line were the same guys they had played all year. The minimizing of Steve Angeli's performance, and I don't believe that I'm doing that at all. I believe that's called context, and I don't think providing context is minimizing, because I've said Steve played very well. But when you're going against a group of linebackers, and this affects Steve quite a bit, that are all backups at the off-ball linebackers, you're missing their best cornerback, didn't play, their third best cornerback didn't play, and their best safety didn't play. Though that has zero bearing, the back level guys on the defensive line, offensive line. The linebackers have some of an impact on the offensive line, but the defensive line being intact has a much bigger impact on the offensive line. Their performance then in turn allowed Steve to take advantage of the fact that they were depleted on the back end. And so I'm not minimizing anything. I'm providing context. I could blow smoke up your you-know-what and say, boy, that was the greatest performance I've ever seen, and not give any context whatsoever and say, hey, he's going to win a Heisman Trophy someday. But I think it's important to be honest about it. And I have been. The biggest difference is this part that had a bigger impact on Steve's performance was completely depleted. The group that had the biggest outcome on the way the offensive line played was intact. And so that matters. I mean, one of the guys at Florida State's banking their defensive line being good again on this year transferred from Oregon State. He played in that bowl game. They dominated him. So that's the difference. So I'm not minimizing anything. I'm providing proper context. That's the reality of it. And in this particular instance, you can't deny that the West Virginia team that Drew Aller played in the opener was better than the Oregon State team that Steve Angeli played in the bowl game. I don't know how you can deny that. I don't think that's even debatable. And so I can't really debate that one, but I just want you to understand there's a reason why I say it. I'm not picking and choosing the differences. Very clearly explained why one holds more weight to me than the other. That's what I'm making very clear in this particular one. All right. And I believe that's going to do it for today's show because honestly, my voice is pretty much going. And I don't like it when I get to the point where I can feel it's about to crack and it gets all high pitched. I'm like, yeah, I don't like that one a whole lot. So anyway, that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. Thank you all so much for your patience and sticking with me for today's mailbag. I really appreciate you all very much. We'll be back tomorrow with a post-game show. Vince and I will go live once the game is over. We'll start heading back and we'll go live. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel and you've hit the notification bell because then you'll know what time we're going to go. I'll also tweet out what time we will go tomorrow as well, and I will post the link on the message board. So you have tons and tons of ways of knowing when to go live tomorrow. Until then, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. And as guys like Andrew Gilmore, whose chops I bust all the time in the show, it's all in good fun. He has joined the message board. WSJ recently joined the message board. Anyone that has joined it will tell you it is so worth the investment. There's no doubt about it, but you've got to give it a shot. And as I challenged you all before, if you haven't done it already, sign up from now until the end of fall camp. And I promise you, if you stick with us that long, even if it's a monthly membership, you're going to want to stick with us long term. I'm confident in that. The vast majority are going to want to do that, but you got to be willing to give it a shot and check it out and see what we got going on. So I just want to thank everybody for being with us today. I really appreciate y'all very, very much. Have an awesome rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again very, very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.